Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, the State of ICS OT Cybersecurity, sponsored by Acronis, Clarity, Dispel, Dragos, Fortinet, Insane Cyber, Keystrike, and OpSWAT. My name is Brianna Nix of SANS. Today's featured speaker is Jason Christopher, SANS Certified Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Jason.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Brianna. So everyone, thank you for attending. This is an effort that we've done here at SANS for the past almost 10 years. So 2017 was the first time we kicked off the sort of state of ICS security. If you're not familiar with me, my name again is Jason Christopher. I'm a SANS certified instructor and course author. I teach ICS 456, which is our sort of essentials of NERC SIP course. So if you're in the electric sector and you've been worrying about those regulations, that is part of my background from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, U.S. Department of Energy, and many years in consulting after that. And I also co-authored a course 418 with Dean Parsons, where we hyper-focus on 2 days just for ICS security for managers, which is obviously a very difficult sort of transitionary discussion between what you have to do from managing assets at the plant or in field devices, or having to manage teams and bring those both together from an IT and OT perspective. So really looking forward to this conversation, actually, from the overall discussion here at SANS. Prior to being a SANS instructor, I would always look forward to this survey. And part of the reasoning was, even as somebody who's working for the federal government, literally working with hundreds of different industrial organizations, the very first question you get asked when you go on site is, how am I doing compared to my peers? And unfortunately, the very first answer I would give is, we really don't know all that much. Having a survey like this allows people to be able to take a look at this from a trending perspective, but also benchmarks. And we've discovered over the years it's been very highly predictive, meaning if somebody says that they plan on doing something over the next year or two, they end up doing it when we ask the follow-up questions in the preceding years. And without our sponsors, this would not be possible. So I'm really happy and excited to be able to highlight our sponsors over the course of the forum that we have today. From Fortinet, Clarity, Dragos, Keystrike, OpSWAT, Dispel, Acronis, and Insane Cyber. All of these are experts in their field, and they're really going to deep dive with me on some of these results. What a lot of folks don't see behind the scenes when we get ready for a survey like this is the months of activity going into it. We kick these off really early in the year, trying to understand what are the trends and problems we want to be able to highlight and benchmark against, then actually releasing the survey, promoting the survey, making sure that we have a good sample size for people to be able to compare to, and then getting the results and crunching the numbers and really seeing from a data analytics perspective, what are some of the correlations that we can find between folks who are doing really, really well, folks who may be struggling a little bit in these areas. And without the sponsors, none of this would be possible. So really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have over the next few hours as we talk through that. From a breakdown perspective, I'm going to launch into what we found out during this year's survey. So for the first 30 minutes or so, the keynote address is really looking at the survey results themselves, how it is that we've been able to parse through some of those different analytics and really give you insights into the things that maybe you want to hyper focus on yourself as you build out and mature part of your ICS and OT security program. I will then have 15-minute presentations from our first set of sponsors, Fortinet, Clarity, and Dragos, before inviting them all to the stage as we have a panel discussion on some of the key topics and highlights that for them were really meaningful and impactful. We'll then break for a little bit, not a huge break, but enough for us to be able to just sort of recharge, re-energize, because you're going to get a lot of information in a short period of time, allow for that mental elasticity as you absorb some of the content. When we come back, I'll invite Keystrike, OpSWAT, and Dispel to be able to provide their own presentation discussions before, again, having a good panel discussion and a keynote panel discussion at the very end with Acronis and Insane Cyber. So I'm really looking forward to what we're going to be highlighting for you. This has been something that I've now been sitting on for months of being able to talk about these results. So hopefully you're going to be able to see that and really understand some of the cool things that we've been able to get from the trending and analysis data over the past couple of months. If you have any questions, that's what we have Zoom for. So use the Q&A feature. Outside of the presentations, we'll be able to answer those. So maybe you're not getting real-time feedback immediately, but we'll get through those questions and maybe we'll be able to answer a couple of those live during the panels themselves too. So hyper use that focus feature if you can. And to level set, as I get into some of my own discussion points here. When we think about industrial cybersecurity, remember we're talking about information technology, IT, and OT, operational technology. And just for level setting very quickly, when we're talking through these discussion points, if you're thinking things from an IT perspective, you're typically talking about the triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability for our data that's at rest, in motion, and use. This could be everything from sensitive data internal to the organization, like intellectual property, to customer and billing data, but it's going to be the things where the zeros and ones themselves is that data construct. On the OT side, the data, the zeros and ones, is actually going to be opening a lever, turning a valve, a breaker, switch. This is where we're going to be talking more about things in terms of safety and reliability. So the construct between these two is a little bit different. And the way that we attach this from a technology perspective, from a cultural perspective, from what impacts may happen from an IT event versus an OT event are extremely different. But every sort of good story, every sort of good attack discussion starts with the IT sphere of things. For again, the state of ICS and OT security, we are really focusing on things that are happening in the OT environment, knowing that there's going to be boundary discussions and how it is that we play between IT and OT throughout, but we're really talking about the more impactful technology on that operational side. And diving into the survey. So the survey is now live. You can actually go onto the URL that was associated with this webcast. You can download the survey itself. I just did so prior to make sure that everything's working correctly. And when you go through that, you're going to see a couple of new things that we did this year. One was how it is that we looked at the problem set. And we really wanted to make sure that when we're asking these questions, we asked in the way that OT operators and engineers think. And part of it is they think about things in terms of the past, the present, and the future. And that's exactly how we sort of went through the question set. If you've paid attention to the survey results over the past few years, we've really had some remarkable discussion points about what controls are in place, how the workforce is being managed. And what we've really discovered in some of that, especially last year, we did a 5-year historical look back, was that those trends really have been cementing things over time. And we've got a little bit of that look back in this year's survey, but we really wanted to focus on what we now know are the prevalent trends from a threat perspective, and are we managing for those threats? And in looking at that, we wanted to make sure that we're putting that together in a way that everybody can understand overall what this means for your OT security program. And when we look at the respondents themselves, we have a really good mix of different folks from the different sectors. Every year, energy sector really shows up. They really go through the survey every single time. So not surprising to see, again, sort of a 20%, 1 in 5 answer set was coming from an energy sector participant. Also, again, probably heavily focused on North American operations and headquarters, but we do have a really good sort of mix of things that are happening globally, especially on the operational side of things. And then the workforce, we had a really good mix of folks that were just across the board, different sizes. And again, I'm thinking about this from a benchmarking perspective. When you read the results and you say, so what does this mean for me? I want you to understand that you're talking to a pool of your peers largely. And that peer set is you can see even on the workforce side, really even keel in terms of the size and maybe even the maturity levels that we're talking across the board. But first, I wanted to highlight some of the headlines because these headlines, we wanted to make sure were informing us about how it is we're asking questions to asset owners and operators. And you could see some of the things here, like the typhoon season, as we've been calling it, Vote Typhoon being one of them, talking about adversaries that could get embedded into our systems and living off the land techniques that maybe we weren't looking for before. This idea that there's global threats to energy infrastructure following different events that have happened, like the Iberian blackout, NISA and the EU talking about DDoS and data breaches for EU public administrations, giving you a threat landscape perspective. Canadian authorities also talking about the exposure to industrial control systems, ransomware hitting manufacturing quite a bit, and the geopolitical tensions that we now know that we're really in, right? This is a team sport for sure, but things that are happening on the global stage are now impacting things from a local perspective, from your communities, because industrial control systems are the way that we power civilization. So seeing them as a target can have a little bit of a jarring effect. And when we look at these headlines, you always have to take it a little bit with a grain of salt. Like, are these things really happening? What are the real world impacts? What could this mean for me and my organization? And so that's where we start. We start with the actual conversation of, well, what were your incidents like? And you can see here, again, about 1 in 5 participants actually did have some sort of security incident that impacted their industrial control system environment. The large majority of those came from unauthorized external access. Insider misuse was also top up there. Ransomware was a little bit of a slip. Wasn't as high as we'd seen in previous years, but still rounding out the top three for those folks who suffered an incident of what that looked like for them. And the insight here is that these have, again, real world impacts. When we're talking about an incident in the industrial control system, we're talking about the zeros and ones that, again, open lever, turn a valve, it's actual machinery, actual real world things that are taking place. And 40% reported some sort of ICS OT disruption during the incident. However, and this is going to get to one of the trends that we started seeing, regulated entities reported 50% less financial losses and safety impacts overall. There'll be a lot of correlation, a lot of discussion as I'll get into more of this regulations versus threats discussion. But it's really going to be sort of insightful to be able to see that when we talk about regulations, they do set that low bar, right? I mean, regulations aren't going to give you some of the highest, most routine standards that you could have out there, but it will set a level base for where everybody should achieve. And we're now seeing some real world impacts from those regulations as well. And on the threat side, on these incidents, we introduced some of these concepts in last year's paper, talking about sort of the irrefutable laws of what it takes to have an industrial control system attack. From that entry point on the IT system to then having an attacker pivot into your industrial control system, then you'll probably not see them. They're probably going to go offline. They're going to develop their capabilities specific to your industrial control system environment. They're going to validate their attack, also probably not on your system because they don't want you to find out what they're about to do before they get into the delivery of the ICS attack. And then they actually are doing this sort of adjustment and modification until they lead to the incident. They lead to the big boom that they want to have. On the defender side, there are things that we can do to prevent that timeline from taking place. And in that first sort of view of the world, you're using your common IT controls. Again, every good sort of attack story starts with what happens in the IT environment. During that pivot, you're really talking about your traditional perimeters, your firewalls, similar to be able to make sure that you don't have the attacker sort of getting through the Swiss cheese of different things they could to get into your industrial control system. To hardening controls, the traditional things that we could possibly try to do, which again is very tough for things like controllers and sort of embedded devices where maybe we don't have the ability to have antivirus or common IT controls. We're now in the guts of things that are in our industrial control systems. We're toughening where we can. We're having situational awareness and data protection where we're able to have it. And then that threat detection. If they're doing the delivery of the attack, do I have specific threat detection for industrial control systems before then declaring an incident, unfortunately, going through containment eradication, and actually recovering? And the reason I highlight these two timelines, because these are sort of the timelines that really matter to get this idea of how long does it take to recover from an incident. And in that first sort of discussion, we call about the compromise to detection gap. From the time the attacker gets into your system, how long does it take you to, in this case, detect and possibly then declare that incident, which leads us to the detection to containment gap. How long does it take me from detection to actually close off everything, get ready for, hopefully, my remediation, which would be my containment to remediation gap? These three timelines we put together. We talk about this during the SANS ICS curriculum to be able to understand, again, this idea of mean time to respond and recover from an incident. And we asked the folks, those 1 in 5 folks, how do they do when looking at these things? And there's actually some good news here. We are detecting far quicker than we ever did. I mean, this is actually a little bit of a surprising statistic to be able to say that from that industrial control system side now, not the IT side, but on the OT side, we have over 50% are detecting in less than 24 hours. To give you an idea, from the 2019 data that we had, so over 6 years ago, going through the SANS ICS, different surveys we were roughly in the 2 to 7 day mark. So marked improvement across the board for what we're doing in this industry. And it shouldn't surprise too many people because of the way that we're looking at detection, right? That's been really the hallmark of a lot of ICS programs as a result. And this containment to detection to containment gap, we're now seeing a thicker tail, which again, probably shouldn't surprise anybody. Once we detect, it's probably going to take you longer to contain that adversary. And so we're starting to see these, like, I know there's smaller percentages, but it's a thicker tail for sure compared to the more 0% on the other side. We're not talking about some of these containments could take up to a year. And then we get to this sort of weird one on the side, right? This idea that what does it take? I got a thicker tail and now a much longer tail when I'm looking at remediation. Because think about this from an incident response perspective for ICS. it's not going to be necessarily an easy day for you to be able to get to the new normal, whatever that may be for you. Maybe manual operations, it could be a whole lot of host of other things, but we're now seeing that this could be over a year in some of these cases to be able to deal with that. When we're looking at like how do we put this all together? What does this mean for incident response? And again, this is the past look back of what took place over the past year. This is a great quote from the Department of Homeland Security. I know it's now a 16-year-old quote, but I'm going to use this quote until we start getting this a little bit right. Quote from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security: standard cyber incident remediation actions deployed in IT business systems may result in ineffective and even disastrous results when applied to industrial control systems cybersecurity events. Well, good news, bad news, depending on how you want to look at this. Glass half empty, glass half full. 57%, almost 60%. So we're almost at a clear majority here of respondents have an ICS-specific incident response plan. That does mean 43% do not, which is a little concerning. And within that, most of them test them annually, which is actually an increased amount, specifically for folks who are testing quarterly. We did not see that in previous survey data. Something about this year, we had a whole lot of more people get into looking at a quarterly incident response tabletop or similar across their industrial control system environment. And tabletops are still the majority way that people like to be able to look at this. We are seeing a slight increase in operational drills, technical simulations, things that's more fingers to keyboard. Tabletops are great, but if we can get more technical, obviously, the better you're going to be at incident response, right? If you're training like it's game day, if you play only tag football and then all of a sudden somebody tackles you, that first time is probably really going to suck. But if you're able to get better at it, if you're able to get to muscle memory, getting into these more technical drills is definitely a trend we want to be able to see more folks do. And we see folks doing more variety, thankfully, all these different types of exercises over time. And 80% of respondents in the past year actually updated their incident response plan. What was interesting was asking folks, why did you do that? There were two major reasons. One was threats, and the other was audit findings. So again, this idea that we're now getting a little bit smarter if we're comparing what's happening both on the intel side, on the threat side, as well as the regulatory side, which was sort of the big theme of the 2025 white paper as you go through it. What you're going to see is that we're going to have a big discussion in there about what are threats doing and how does this sort of shape my program from the perspective that these are going to be more reactionary. It's going to be really based on intelligence gathering, so I really understand how am I doing information sharing a lot better than before. And regulations, sort of that, what is the floor? What is the bare minimum that maybe I need to be able to do that my peers and I have all agreed from a standards perspective we need to be able to look at? It's a lengthier process. It's going to really trail behind threats by, in some cases, multiple years. And understanding that this is going to influence how your compliance program works and therefore how your security program investments go, both of these things need to be considered when looking at the overall trending analysis. And when we looked at this from a threat perspective, we actually were asking people, well, what are you doing for threat intelligence? Now knowing that we've got a really big hook here, that you're updating our incident response plan because of threats. So how are you getting your intel? Well, good news is, again, we have about 67% of folks who are actually going through and getting intelligence, and they're getting it from many different sources. The interesting thing is that some of these sources, like government pieces, there has been a little bit of chaos, sort of in the beginning of this discussion point about, are you getting it from the federal government? Are you getting it from a state government? If you're here in the United States, are you getting it globally? Are you looking at sort of larger sort of information sharing collectives that are currently underway that weren't there previously? And we also saw a really good showing from peer-to-peer sharing, information sharing analysis centers, and participation in those. However, one thing that we did know when we started asking people about information sharing, only 21% provide two-way flow, meaning almost 80% are only consuming. There's no information sharing going back. So if 70% of your program, if you have a large percentage of your program is really based off of, am I using information sharing from my peers, you may find it in a way that it is going to be sort of working against you in some ways if you're only worrying about like 20% of people feeding that information back. So it needs to sort of be in this two-way flow to be able to work through. That said, 93% of people who do any sort of information sharing find benefit, which is actually a staggering statistic to be able to think of. Meaning that if you're in a peer-to-peer sharing group, if you're in an ISAC, 93% found value in having that type of relationship, which is overwhelmingly positive compared to almost any other Intel discussion we had. And looking at, again, those threats, unsurprising for ransomware, for the targeted environments, whether we're talking about supply chain, every single category went up in terms of how folks were looking at them being targeted. And we saw a lot about remote access, and we're going to get into a deep dive onto that later today as well, because that's going to be one of the prevailing themes that we're going to have throughout this. And from a sort of how do you then respond to the threats? If you're getting threat intelligence, ideally you're not just reading these threat intel reports and doing nothing about it. So what are you doing to change your behaviors, maybe change your technology deployments? And the clear majorities here, sort of around the top 5, was updating their detection rules, changing asset monitoring coverage, accelerating segmentation or architecture improvements they may have, getting new training put in place so people know what to do with these threats. What was interesting also is that we asked were no changes made. And you can see here, 9% said no changes made, which again, showing the value of intelligence. That means 91% of people did something based off the intelligence they were gathering. So we've got overwhelming positivity on being able to say, I'm getting value out of information sharing, and I'm actually changing my program based off the intelligence that we're receiving. So if you're not on sort of the using ICS-specific, OT-specific threat intelligence at this stage of the game, this may be a set of benchmarks that would be willing for you to be able to look at how it is you may want to be able to change those capabilities or improve investment in them. Regulations, also sort of similar. We had a whole lot of people who are regulated who answered the survey, over 77% of them. And we asked then, well, how many sort of facilities are being regulated? And unsurprising, there was a wide mix here. And this really should tell you that there's no such thing as sort of a common compliance program. Somebody who is going through regulations for 2 to 10 facilities is going to be very different than somebody who's got over 100 facilities that they're going to be going through the same regulation for. And so understanding that the technology stack is going to be a little bit different. And then we also noticed, because the energy sector is so highly regulated, 14 respondents in the energy sector reported some possible violation in 2025. Other sectors, non-energy sectors, had twice that amount. So again, I think that's partly a maturity level discussion, especially here in North America, where we've had sort of NERC-CIP and other regulations that have looked at cybersecurity for the past 10 plus years. We also noted that for those folks who were having the other sector discussion and getting more possible violations, only 53% of them were regulated. So they had more violations, were far less regulated. And then again, it's not saying that regulation, quote unquote, is good. It is noting that if you are regulated, because of possibly the things that are happening from your budget cycles, the internal audit reviews, the external audits that you're doing, there's a constant focus that even has the board level presentations and discussions that are happening that may be driving your security program in different ways, which we did ask. Well, what were the different ways that regulation was pushing you? If threats are pushing you to be able to do more on detections, do more on segmentation, what are the regulations pushing you to do? And again, not totally surprising, but a lot of them sort of aligned with each other. What threats were doing compared to what regulations are pushing you to do are roughly the same. Vulnerability management tools, not as sort of relevant in some of the threat discussions that we're having. And obviously process improvements, documentation management, none of that is really a threat intel driven driver. But we are seeing, again, this idea that both of these things are driving you to do more, especially in things like logging, segmentation, secure remote access. Both regulations and threats, if you're using those as sort of your driver for your program, are bringing you to the same conclusion in just different ways. And so that detection, that logging, that monitoring, the detection of things, we ask people, well, how are you doing ICS OT detection? Because we are, again, much better at this than we were back in 2019, where it was taking us 2 to 7 days on average for us to be able to find an incident. And we're now in this sort of beyond 24-hour discussion. And looking at this, not surprisingly, we're talking about more passive visibility tools, because not in all environments can we use active, protocol-aware anomaly detection, host-based detections where we can have them installed. So by the numbers, you may say that looks really good. Like 75% are using protocol-aware anomaly detection. Except when I give you the preceding question was just the yes or no, are you doing this? So it's 75% of 49% that are actually ones who are using protocol-aware anomaly detection or passive visibility tools. So you can see here the growth has been there for quite a bit. We've far more mature here than we have before. As I said earlier, we are very predictive with these surveys. So this 24% who say that they're planned in the next 12 to 24 months, Just based off of the historical relevance that we've had with these surveys in the past, I can tell you with high confidence value that that 24% will likely be saying yes when we ask this question again in the next year or two, just based off of the sort of long cycles it takes for us to install and develop capabilities in ICS. So we are headed in that right trajectory. If this is something that you're not doing yet, again, I would use this as sort of your benchmarking and trending discussion, maybe internal to your organizations. That said, we also see that OT SOCs are on the rise. So 50% of respondents have either an OT-specific SOC or a merged IT-OT SOC. And we sort of compared this then to the ICS kill chain, like how are we doing there? And unfortunately, 13% of respondents had full visibility over the kill chain. If you're not familiar with the kill chain, the idea here is that the attacker is going for loss, denial, manipulation, loss of view or control or safety. And they're doing this through staged approach, right? Where they're able to go through stage one of the kill chain, understand how your systems work, and then pivot into stage two, which is that ICS-specific capabilities. If you're not familiar with this white paper, highly recommend it. It's the basis for a lot of the discussions we have in the SANS ICS curriculum. And when we look at it from an attack perspective, I look at both stage one and stage two, we've had attacks over the years that have sort of demonstrated what this could look like. From Configure, where it's really not focusing on anything, but it's going to wreak havoc in your sort of stage one environment. APT1 being sort of the first sort of adversary that the US government was saying, hey, these folks are looking at what you could do in ICS. They really didn't get into ICS, but they're getting the information out of it. Even Havocs, being able to talk about remote access Trojan, but it didn't have sort of the ICS capabilities to cause an outage, to cause a reliability or safety event. Whereas the two who did, by just name brand, it can't be an ICS discussion if I can't say the word Stuxnet. So at least once, here's your Stuxnet word of the day. Seeing Stuxnet and the Ukraine outages that happened in 2015 and 2016, obviously being the ones where we could see the entire kill chain. So it went from the IT environment into the OT environment and led to an impact. So again, the statistic there, only 13% of respondents said they had full visibility across that entire kill chain. And you have to ask yourself, if you have a bad day, how will you know? And without having that type of visibility, you may not. So ramping into this discussion, a lot of the things that you'll hear from us, especially throughout the SANS ICS curriculum, is that the protection is ideal, but detection is a must. And I'd even caveat it further, that detection without the ability to respond is probably of little value. So how do we get better at this? So what should we focus on to be able to help out with that additional visibility where we can? Well, we broke this into 3 different categories that we thought would be helpful to be able to look at across the Purdue model. The first was risk-based vulnerability management. Not talking about patch management, but talking about things that would be impactful for industrial control systems. OT-specific threat hunting. What does it look like to look for the bad guys in your systems? Let me make a hypothesis that they're going to be residing in a certain system, and how would you look for them? And then OT-aware penetration testing, right? The idea that we can do pen testing. It just require a little bit more sort of oomph and a little bit more sort of discovery as we do so. And we then compared that to what we would do across the Purdue model. And the question is, where can we do these 3 capabilities? And I would say everywhere, but you can see that I also have fine print that says kind of. It's not going to be necessarily everywhere that you can. And when I'm about to show you, I don't want to sort of say we need to do this everywhere, but I want to give a good indication about where we are or not having these capabilities. And in the report, I know this looks like an eye chart, but you could probably just follow the colors alone. We looked at, as we get lower into the Purdue model, we're not necessarily doing as much on detection, vulnerability management, threat hunting, and pen testing. And it's, again, not to say that everything needs to be blue in every single level, but when we talk about that kill chain, when we talk about what an adversary is able to do, where are you investing your resources? Where are you looking for the bad guy? What does that mean to you from an incident response and recovery capability? So that last graph, it's the first time that I think everyone's really looked at it from a Purdue level and being able to talk about those capabilities. I highly recommend spending some time with that, especially if you are interested in those capabilities. Understanding that that could be a little bit depressing, especially if you're like an OT ICS threat hunter, you may think, wow, we should probably do a little bit more of this. Where's the good news? Well, to summarize and to get us through our first set of presentations, the first one is that defense is absolutely doable. Asked, is the organization actively incorporating ICS OT cyber resilience strategies into broader enterprise disaster recovery and business continuity planning? You can see here, we are doing this really well. We're doing better at this, I should say, because as industrial organizations, we know what business continuity, we know what disaster recovery looks like. We're able to bring that into from a natural disaster perspective of like, hey, what does an earthquake look like? What does it look like to have wildfires? Can we respond and recover? We know what to do for that. Are we bringing cybersecurity in? And looking at this, the trend is getting better. it was not this good, again, like 7 years ago when we were first having these type of conversations. So really insightful to be able to see that we're in sort of involving more of the business continuity folks who don't speak cyber and understanding what that looks like for us. And we start talking about specific scenarios. Unsurprisingly, the number one is ransomware, but seeing more people focus on the concerns of supply chain, insider threats, geopolitical tensions, even AI-enabled discussions. We're looking at the right things to be able to test the scenarios that we care about the most. And we're making the right improvements. You can see across the board here, we're seeing a lot more folks get into a visibility of what's happening inside of our ICS and OT discussions. Again, that kill chain analysis really becoming a forefront discussion that we have. And then secure remote access platforms, zero trust and OT. Also being able to have a conversation about what this looks like for our overall program. So what does it look like for us investing in the next 12 to 24 months, understanding threat detection platforms, analytics, vulnerability management. We're doing the right thing to be able to make these improvements. And across the board, we're seeing that asset visibility, secure, and I'd argue modern remote access being a forefront, as well as vulnerability management tools overall. And we're getting better together. So this idea of IT and OT working together, we're seeing this sort of strong cross-functional culture now becoming more of a forefront discussion. The majority of folks, almost 49%, I'm almost there at the majority, are seeing improving and growing collaboration between OT, IT, and leadership. And as part of that, we are seeing, again, this better trend where 5 years ago, 46% of respondents said they had no IT, OT strategy in place at all. And 30% reported low or no interaction across these areas. So seeing that we're growing in better culture is, again, a fantastic trend for us to be able to say, if we're better at culture, it doesn't matter what strategy I have. One of the quotes that we use in 418, that the idea here is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. How do I get better at that? It's reaching across the table for both IT and OT working together on a common mission. And then finally, my last sort of points here, we did ask, how prepared is your organization to respond to future cyber threats targeting ICS and OT environments? Fully prepared, largely, partially, or not? You can see here, 14% said that they were fully prepared for not today's threats, but future threats. And we really want to ask, like, what's going on here? Is this something where we have some maybe lessons learned that we could be able to look at and be able to provide to folks? And this is one of the sort of conclusion points that you'll see in the paper. And I'll turn it over to our first panel discussions. Because if you want to be at the top of the class, if you want to be somebody who's so confident that you'll answer on the survey, yes, I'm prepared for future cyber threats for our industrial control system environments. To be in the top of the class, there are 3 things that I want you to focus on. That first one is going to be investing in that complete ICS cyber kill chain visibility. When we saw this from our organizations that were doing this, organizations that felt fully prepared were 3.7 times more likely to invest in that complete visibility across the ICS cyber kill chain. For being proactive with information sharing. Like I said, everybody saw a value out of that. Like an alarming amount of people, 93% of people saw value in information sharing. When we look at the majority of the stakeholders, 57%. So of that sort of discussion point of being in that sort of top tier, we're providing that two-way flow of information. So the top ones, the ones who are feeling the most prepared, are doing the two-way flow of information across that. And then involving, of all people, your field technicians, your operators, and your engineers. We may have over-indexed on saying that we want to invite executives to all the parties. What we found is one of the more highlightful things to be able to look at was this idea that if you are a top organization in this survey this year, you're 66% more likely to involve field technicians, operators, and engineers in your tabletop exercises. We always talk about the executive, but this is probably the one you want to reach into the most now, because if your field tech is involved and they understand cybersecurity and they're part of that discussion, we found way more benefits in almost any other class or any other sort of level of management or executive across the board. This was one of the most deciding factors for if you're in that 14% that said you're ready for the future of cyber threats. And with that, I know I went a little bit over, so I'm going to rapid fire right into Rich. Rich joins us from Fortinet. He is a senior director of OTO. We went past your intro. There we go. Rich works alongside regional marketing teams, OT product management, and OT threat research to promote Fortinet fabric of OT solutions, including network security, zero trust, security operations, and AI-powered threat intelligence for IT, OT, converged, and OT market segments. Rich, always a pleasure to have you. And please turn on your camera and welcome to the stage. Rich, we have you off mute and camera.
Uh,
Have voice now.
okay, it's just a little bit of a lag coming across there. Have you got me now?
Yes, we do.
Great. All right, great. So, Jason, first of all, congratulations for the publication of this report. It's a big effort, and then just helping the broader community as well. So congratulations, and then also thank you for bringing me in as we, as a community, look to increase the common denominator of OT security. And so this is. I appreciate the drill down and so forth, but I also feel like I have to step back and kind of exhale and say things are getting better. And I think we've seen this. My background coming from energy generation, from manufacturing, and then on into the vendor space. So I've been on kind of both sides of the table, and it has changed dramatically and for the good in the last couple of years. So if everybody can exhale with me, we're getting there. And then I'll go through some slides to kind of definitely drive home some points that Jason talked about, and then also bring in some other aspects as well. So with that, I will move in the next slide. Oops, sorry about that. That was my bad. Um, so is one of the things I wanted to bring out, and Jason talked about correlation, and I talked about the common denominator, and so I actually brought in some results that we have from a Fortinet survey, and this is not to all of a sudden try to steal the show, but again, it's about that correlation. Like so, what are the common themes here? And so the first two here on the top about talking about maturity, and that's going to be a large part about my theme here, but talking about process maturity. And so what I really appreciate about the SANS report is it really drills down. It gets very, very specific about aspects that can be really insightful. But from what we've seen here, again, correlating the two is that we're good, we're good about detection, which is the first step. But that maturity aspect is missing. Now, this level four maturity that's talked about here, that is a self-assessment. And I think that's the other part that the report really drives home here too, is about really incorporating third parties to validate where you are. It's easy and it's total human behavior to convince ourselves that we're better than we are. But to bring in those pen testers, to bring in third parties, in order to really bring that home and validate that is really important. So that we got to be careful about that. So there's a little yeah, tidbit there about self-evaluation. Um, but the going into the process maturity again, we're good about the paperwork. And we're good about the detection piece of it, but it really then goes through that whole a recovery piece of it and that live fire exercise and the purple teaming that the paper really drills down into. So really always take maturity and process maturity with a grain of salt. A three-ring binder is not going to protect you. So it's really about exercising it. Moving on to the purple side here about the solution maturity. So here you can see there's level two. So we recognize that our solutions are lagging the process, which is totally natural. Um, and what we've seen is that we're still in early days, which is the visibility, the segmentation. We're starting to get into the zero trust piece of it, where zero trust is tough in the OT network. But the concept of an OT SOC is distant, or could be, is more strategic. Um, and I think that that maturity, of which I'm going to break down a little bit, is also reflective in what Jason talked about as far as the kill chain, right? As far as, again, you've got to have a diverse set of solutions in place in order to effectively um, address gaps in the kill chain. So, although we're starting off and we're building good momentum on the solution side, we've then need to look to see how we can accelerate that because we are exposed on the back end of that kill chain. The impact of intrusions here. And what I was bringing out is the maturity is indicative of the type of intrusions. Lower maturity, you're going to have the basic type of detections around phishing attacks. Higher maturity, you're actually going to be getting into ransomware and malware and OT malware. So the point I like to correlate to this is, and Jason did a great job of talking about that, is OT threat intelligence. Um, so in that, in Jason's in the report, it talks about a lot of reliance on the vendors, of which I'm one of them, and we've got our labs and so forth. But those labs also then network out to various government and other education entities in order to again aggregate as much information as possible. So I think that's a great point as far as the ISACs and then also the two-way trading piece of it is that we have to knit together this intelligence, right? There isn't just one feed me intelligence and you get everything in the globe, right? From what's going on in the latest in Ukraine to what's going on locally with ransomware attempts in IT that are affecting OT, right? You really do have to kind of knit these together right now. And the world is doing this, right? Again, building that common denominator, but that OT threat intelligence is super important because and I think the key piece of it too that Jason pulled out is the updating of those detection rules and policies. So it's a cycle, right? So the world is moving, I'm not going to say light speed, but new things are coming up all the time. And a threat intelligence feed is great, but it's really what is the action on that? And then what is actionable in your network? So that process of how do we iterate as we receive this intelligence feed is the most important piece of this. And as in the world of what is now Gen AI and agentic AI and all the AIs, is that the bad actors are accelerating their capabilities. We as defenders are also accelerating, but the thing is moving faster. So to be able to process that threat intelligence, update those policies, and now we're starting to be able to get that kind of 0 day plus one, if you will. But as we mature in our solutions, we're going to be able to actually identify potential 0 days as well. Moving on to the last part here about regulations and compliance. Um, this is an interesting crossroads. And Jason, hearkening back, and I can as well. Used to be the surveys were kind of one question: Are you air gapped? And the answer was yes, and we all walked away. The world has changed dramatically. Being in the NERC SIP world and in that highly regulated um, in regards to all the other industries, it's interesting to step out of that into the rest of industry and where there's relatively very little. And so with that, it is now up to individuals and individual corporations, entities, and governments in order uh, to create those security policies and then act as if they are regulated. So there's this, we were waiting on regulations. The world was kind of crashing. The shifting sands out in the US here locally from a government standpoint in any country has government shifts, but it's much more of a now you have to protect yourself. Like the cavalry's not coming over the hill. So I thought that was interesting as far as the internal policies and then as far as the compliance and then also the regulators at a high level. So that is really surprising to see that we are making that step of internal compliance as well. So moving on to the next slide. The other thing that we need to consider here is that um, the other game changer, which is this elevation of OT risk. And this is some data out of the Fortinet report, but Jason talked about as far as IT teams and OT teams, and a large reason why those things have shifted are because of the elevation of risk and then of that adoption by the C-suite, where before it was just a budget line item held by a plant manager. And you can, across the bottom here, you can see how the CISO has taken on over the last 4 years, as well as other members of the C-suite. But what's the counter data set to that is the VP or lower piece. You can see that it really has been elevated out of the operational spaces. So this is something to really to embrace as well, is that as we're doing our daily job and as we're working with these other teams, is that I was working maybe more of my operational chain of command. However, my day-to-day actions are now moving up into the executives. Right. So that's helping us accelerate from an investment and resources standpoint, but it also needs to be a wake-up calls from us in the OT space that this is a corporate priority and really should hopefully again accelerate everything we do. Moving on, talking about best practices. These are the Fortinet best practices, which ironically look very similar to our friends here in SANS and Dragos as well. And then let's not forget about CIS controls with the ICS implementation guide. But there are numerous best practices out there. The Fortinet ones are a little bit shaped somewhat differently, but the point being is that we're still needing to deploy visibility segmentation. But then there's some future considerations here, and I would also just say that we also have another key driver here, which is a lack of resources. We hear this everywhere in cybersecurity. It's compounded in OT. So as we're bringing on all of this newness and we're modernizing an Industry 4.0 and all the new tech, is that we need to be smart strategically about how are we consolidating all the monitors, if you will. How can I become operationally efficient as much as possible? And those are the two items in the talking about looking into OT SecOps and then thinking about a platform. And lastly, about the threat intelligence, which I've already discussed. So lots of great information out there. Again, if it's a matter of starting, and then how do we accelerate, measure, continue that ROI and investment and accelerate. So I'm going to wrap up here very shortly. I, oop, one, sorry, double click there. I talked about maturity. This is a way we look at it through these various levels, but I think that it was really driven home in the SANS report about what are you doing now, and most of those solutions are on the left-hand side. And then what is it you're doing going forward in the next 12 to 24 months? A lot of those solutions are the same on the left-hand side. So we're very much starting our journey, right? It's a left-leaning bell curve where the majority of customers are on the left-hand side. So again, if you're in that spot, you can exhale. Most of your peers are there too. But we need to look farther, again, because we have to rapidly accelerate this up this maturity curve, not only because of the bad actors, but again, our internal stakeholder, that CISO coming from the IT side, probably has expectations that we already have these in place. Right. So really look into that maturity piece of it, where we are today in that SANS report, and then where we're going. And I think it's very key as far as how we are planning. And then lastly, and I would have to thank my friend here, Hassan Manzer, for this tapestry that the CISO is looking at, mapping all the OT vendors. It's a new world out there, right? I mean, we have rapidly maturing, some niche players, but there's a lot of new solutions coming into this space. I mentioned Gen AI, I mentioned the modernization piece of it. But this is a tough space and we're making rapid decisions. So really try to take a chance to step back, right? And think strategically again about how we're deploying these things. Look at, do I need all these individual screens? Are there ways that I can knit these together, or are these solutions self-motivated again to aggregate information? Talking about a platform, can I get some operational efficiencies through that? I just talked about the skills gap because I know that I've got a deficit, especially on the OT side. That SOC strategy, like plan now, right? Because you're making decisions, purchases, processes around these individual solutions that you get started, but we need to think about what does that SOC look like, because it's going to be here before we know it. And then at the end of it, how are you going to make that CISO life better, right? Just inherited this OT risk. First question is, what is OT? And now it's a matter of like, how am I able to embrace these IT teams, work off of shared priorities, look for quick win-wins, and then be able to measure and mitigate that risk going forward. So with that, again, I didn't make up any time, Jason. Apologies, but we'll pass it off to the next one and look forward to any questions. And again, thank you so much.
No worries. I always have tricks on my sleeves to be able to make up time. So I'm not too worried about that. I'd rather have great conversations. And thank you very much, Rich, for kicking this off. With that, I'd like to be able to welcome to the camera stage Simeon here from Clarity, VP of Global Technical Sales. Simeon is VP of Global Technical Sales at Clarity, holds a Doctor of Engineering in Cybersecurity Analytics, and leverages over a decade of expertise in sales engineering and cybersecurity to lead teams and deliver innovative tech solutions across various industries. Invite you to turn on your mic and your camera, please.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Can you guys hear and see me?
I can hear and see you just great.
Amazing. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Just making sure I have controls. Here we go. Yeah, once again, Jason, congratulations on publishing such a wonderful report. It's been amazing actually just getting the chance to catch up and read a lot of this stuff. So once again, thank you very much. So I am going to have a conversation and kind of double click into the report itself. And I want to talk about three elements from the report, quite frankly. The conversation today will be focused around what I saw, which is quite frankly, visibility, access, and then resilience. The first, quite frankly, is around the fact that only 12% of the respondents had full visibility across their ICS environments or the ICS kill chain. We've seen improvements in this number. However, the majority still have, quite frankly, visibility issues or visibility gaps in the operations. Most organizations are not still where they want to be from a visibility perspective. And, I think, quite frankly, the challenges and the reasons are still well known, but it's often important that we cover these elements to understand kind of why the visibility has not improved or the visibility is not where most of us would like it to be. Of course, the most obvious one is just the proprietary protocols, right? Most of these OT organizations or these OT devices are operating in protocols and in elements that are vastly different than the security apparatuses that have been built for the IT sectors, right? Oftentimes, our security apparatuses from the IT perspective are incompatible with the ones built for, or the ones that can be aimed at the OT. We have large networks, right? Whether manufacturing or industrial controls or, utilities. Oftentimes, these are well geographically dispersed with large networks, oftentimes small locations and small assets distributed across a large geographic elements. And then from like a people perspective, the ownership of these assets are also oftentimes quite complex, right? The theme here being that the complexity across all these elements, including the devices themselves, is often the enemy of the reasons why visibility has not been achieved in the ways that I think the organizations and we, quite frankly, in the industry would have liked. The second element that I want to talk about today is also what was highlighted in the report, which is around access. The majority, or quite frankly, half of incidents that were reported, external access, so unauthorized external access was the ultimate root cause, right? So if visibility is a challenge, this notion that you can't, protect what you can't see is a key part of the first half of the report. The second element, so the second part I want to talk about today is around the access. We still see access and unauthorized access, whether from internal or misuse, I should say, or access from actual threat operators. This has been a key element of where things have happened to go wrong over the last years, and it's been reflected in the report. It's important to, as we start to try to solve this access problem, for us to incorporate the access and what ultimately is the most important part, which quite frankly is the business outcomes. So that means that when we go to solve this access problem, which represents 50% of the issue, quite frankly, we need to make sure that it's also attached to business outcomes and attached to what the business ultimately needs. That means like the access controls and the access products we put in place should also aim at making the operations of the business also more effective. That means when things go wrong, we have a methodology of minimizing the risk. We are reducing the enemy, which is complexity. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times the problem with visibility and the problem with security in the ICS and OT space tends to be the complexity of things. So we need to think about access and how to solve the access problems in ways that reduce the complexity and minimizes the risk and ultimately improves productivity, right? Whether this is third-party access or seamless, connectivity to the assets that need access, we need to ensure that all these elements are properly planned accordingly. And the third factor that I want to talk about from the report is around resilience. When it comes to business continuity and disaster recovery, few organizations are well equipped, and that number actually goes further lower when you start to talk about elements around the ICS or the OT practice in general. So we need to think about how we incorporate, disaster recovery and, to ensure that when things do go wrong, we start with visibility and we have that visibility that will limit in the number one elements to potential bad outcomes, which is remote access, unauthorized access, and that these things are well planned out and are incorporated into the business continuity of the operations. Because ultimately, with OT security, we're ultimately here to ensure that safety and availability continue in the business. So on that element, when we look to solve the problems of business continuity and operational resilience, we want to make sure that things again that are associated to the business outcomes are also very much tied to the solutions we go for. I think over the last couple of years, IT and OT security have been too much about the technology and not enough about the outcomes that the operations ultimately needs. At the end of the day, we're here to serve the business. And so when you start to think about the notions and what you should be looking for from a business continuity and operational resilience perspective, things like lowering the mean time to resolutions from any solution, whether it's solving the access or solving the visibility challenge, needs to be in place. The need for a holistic visibility across your ICS and your IT elements and even your IoT elements needs to be something that's well thought about. I think the last speaker mentioned something around, not picking point solutions and ensuring that it's ultimately there to solve and serve the business. I fully agree, right? And so therefore, you should look for things that, again, that provide holistic visibility across your asset classes. Ensure that increased operational resilience is a key factor of what you're aiming for as you start to build a CPS or ICS security program. And ultimately, we need to reduce the risk, right? I think there should be conversations that are centered around things like the return on investments, conversations that are centered around the total cost of ownership. But ultimately, I think so long as we are ensuring that we're taking care of I would say the three highlights from the report, which was, of course, one being the lack of visibility across both the ICS and the IT environments and things that affect the operations, that we are having a clear understanding of how access is gained to these assets, because unauthorized access does represent the biggest challenge and the biggest cause of issues in the report. So we need to make sure that we address the unauthorized access challenge, but we do so in a way that favors and supports the business outcomes. Our security cannot be a blocker of operations, especially in that case of OT. And then lastly, that we plan accordingly and ensure that business continuity and disaster recoveries are effectively part of the plan. There's a quote I heard recently which says, I think someone just said it, like, how do you know when you have a bad day, right? I think that's a fantastic quote. We need to ensure that business continuity, when you do have a bad day, is in place so that the bad day doesn't turn into a bad year, doesn't turn into a bad, however long it may take you to recover, right? So there are key elements that we need to ensure are a part of the process to ensure that, ultimately we are both returning a real investment back to the business and also lowering the total cost of ownership for any solution we may pick. So with that, thank you very much. Hopefully I was able to recover some time for you, Jason, and I look forward to the continued conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You did. That was not your responsibility to recover time. That's my responsibility. But thank you very much. It's a team sport. Already really looking forward to some of the themes I could pull out for what we're going to talk about during our panel. I really like the idea that we're talking through already, really the context orientation between what is IT and what is OT, and really focusing on safety and reliability. So hearing that as a common theme, no pressure, Phil, as you now come up. Phil Tonkin from Dragos. Phil is a field chief technology officer at Dragos. Before this, he held the position of chief of staff as the company's top strategic advisor to the CEO, Rob Lee. With that, Phil, please bring yourself onto camera and onto mic. And a reminder that when you are done, we will kick off into a panel. And for those of you who are in the audience, please go ahead and if you've got questions, you can use the Q&A feature inside of Zoom. We could have some of those questions saved for the panel. We can answer some of those live, as a few of you have already put in questions we've been able to do. So please remember, this is a interactive participation, if you like to, as part of these types of forums. So Phil, are you able to bring yourself onto camera and off of mute?
I'm here. Thanks, JD.
Awesome. Perfect. Good seeing you, Phil.
You too. Well, firstly, just want to comment on the overall research program and the results from this survey. It's vital that we have these measurable statistics that help us to understand these trends. I think any of us who've worked in operational technology for any amount of time will understand that we have a good idea of what the issues are and what the challenges are, but we need to make it quantifiable and help people to understand where they are on that journey so that we can really drive maturity in that space. And when you've got so much rich data, it's really quite difficult to pick out which things you most want to to take a look at. So if we just kind of move this slide on, move into the first one. If we look at the some of those key challenges in this space, we still have this significant visibility gap within operational technology. And whilst more and more organizations are saying that they have got visibility into the risks in this space and into the threats, there's still quite a significant gap between those who have full visibility and those who are just on that journey of having some tooling or some capability to understand what the network traffic is within their environments. And the amount of visibility drops the further you go into your environment. The visibility challenge in IT is pretty much being dealt with. But as you move into the OT space, there's less and less coverage. And while most organizations who are on this journey may have put some tooling in place at some of their sites, looked at for some of their crown jewels and tried to identify the key locations to start monitoring, the visibility levels within those are still quite significant. And some of that it comes about not because of the lack of understanding or skills, for of the to the ability to pick the right tools, but the motivation to put the correct tooling in the correct place. Facing challenges of people feeling like they've already got coverage through having IT tools on boundaries and firewalls and missing out on the east-west visibility that they really need to understand the techniques and tactics that that the threat actors are typically playing out in the OT space now, where we're talking about a system of systems and device-to-device communication. So there's still a real challenge with getting the right kind of visibility into the OT space. And there are a number of reasons why IT tools still fail in the OT environment. We still have challenges where tools require the capability to be active in order to understand the assets that are in that space. And there's still a huge amount of reservation, quite deliberately from the operators, the field techs, and the plant staff, who to allowing any kind of active communication in this space. There are too many horror stories that people have of operations failing because somebody has run a scan and didn't think about the consequences of something falling over. A lot of these systems are still old, still very fragile. And while it is possible to be active and to poll devices in a very controlled way, it shouldn't be done using IT tools that go out there trying to discover the assets in this space. A lot of these capabilities really don't understand the industrial protocols that are there. They might do as they pass through a firewall, as you see more greater and greater trend for IT network monitoring tools to start to list out the protocols that are being used in the OT space. But do they really understand the context of how they're being used, why they're being used, and can they really see those protocols when they're not in many cases designed to go through a firewall? Many of them are layer 2 protocols, and so there are still gaps if you rely on those firewalls. And the ability to drive decision making from them. What are you supposed to do with that information when presented? Having that the real lack of depth on the insights that are provided. Yes, you're seeing the context of the fact that a protocol is there, but what are you going to do with that? Is it different? Is it anomalous? Is it indicative of a threat behavior? So when you start to look at what a true OT capability looks like in this space, really need to know where should you start? What is the safest way of deploying? And there's, whilst many organizations are starting to deploy these technologies, we still see that there is a reluctance even to deploy passively and deeply enough into environments because of the amount of change that often is underestimated how much effort it's going to take to get these tools out into the OT environment and make sure that they've got the correct level of coverage. Doing it passively once it's out there has no operational risk, but it takes time to get there, and so that it is still the path of least resistance. making sure that the tools that are deployed into that space are truly protocol aware and not just listing it out on a data sheet. It's important that the communications are understood, identified, and can be classified to make sure that they're not anomalous and not malicious in what they're attempting to achieve. That you can build up from that context and understand the assets that are there, understand the risks and the vulnerabilities that are being baked into the environment through those risks that are visible through proper understanding of the assets in this environment. And making sure that it's something that's continuous. Through these threats can manifest over a great deal of time. When we look at the time to detect, the reason that it's still possible to do it, not just within 6 hours, but over, in a year after the compromise might have happened, is because in many cases the actors that are operating in this space are dwelling for a long time. So looking out carefully, continuously for the behaviors that are manifesting in this space requires a long and continuous monitoring picture, not just a periodic view into the environment. And that's why it's also super important that we consider the challenges of threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is a real multiplier in the capabilities in this space. There are a growing number of organizations taking on board threat intelligence, and in particular operational technology threat intelligence. It's really vital that organizations don't just look for any threats that might be out there. They need to understand the threat actors that are interested in their industries, the ones that are targeting them, what the techniques and tactics and behaviors are of those threat actors. Which vulnerabilities are they exploiting? Are they exploitable within your environment? And so bringing all of that information together can really help you to prioritize the actions that you take. And that combined with the visibility within any environment really does help to amplify the capabilities that exist within this space. If you don't have the context of the threats that are actually manifesting in organizations like your own, it becomes incredibly difficult to correctly prioritize the actions that you're then going to go ahead and take. Bring true ICS threat intelligence in really does make a massive difference, but it's often quite difficult in order to operationalize that intelligence on its own. Unlike a lot of threat intelligence in the IT space, where you get relatively simple indicators of compromise, IT attacks are heavily repeated, highly detectable, because you are looking out there for signatures of malware that's been seen before. You're looking at infrastructure that adversaries are using and repeated again and again. And whilst we should look for those indicators of compromise from prior OT attacks, they are they're not always rich enough to give a view of any future use of the same techniques and tactics and procedures. The compiled hash of a piece of OT malware may never be the same as it's recompiled to be used in other areas. And while there may be a greater use of repeated and more adaptable OT malware in the future, looking at the historic examples, they have been one-off attacks using malware compiled for a particular target. So the simple ways in which antivirus technologies or even hunting for IOCs in these environments, it doesn't always operationalize well. So you then have to start looking more at the behaviors of the threat actors. When you look at the techniques and procedures that they're using in order to get into the environment, you have to think about how they might use them in a slightly different way to adapt to your space. And so going out there and looking for those behaviors, having a process to do it is absolutely vital. But it's challenging for someone to go away and codify that. And so one of the things that we find can really aid that operationalization is to make sure that that kind of threat intelligence is actually built into the detection tools. And with our platform, where everything that is ever written in our threat intelligence reports is automatically codified and deployed into the Dragos platform, and gives those priorities, and the basis of those detections is driven by the threat intelligence about what we know about the actors that are targeting this space. we've heard a lot as well about preparedness. We know that more and more organizations do have plans. They do, are running exercises to validate those plans. Not as many of them are clearly testing those plans as have them, and that's a challenge. But still, there's still a gap there that many organizations, despite having a plan, despite testing the plan, still feel that should an event occur, then don't feel fully prepared against the threats that are coming because the threats are changing, they're increasing in their impact. We're seeing more and more organizations with very significant threats, facing them and huge costs associated with them. So there's still a lack of confidence in this space. And so building on that confidence to deal with an incident can have a huge impact in trying to reduce the impact of an event when it inevitably does occur. It is not possible to prepare for an attack by just defending against every single one of them proactively. Something will change. There will always be a time where an adversary has got a new capability that hasn't yet been understood and therefore can compromise the defensive controls. So being prepared, is absolutely vital. And one of the key reasons to ensure that that is the case is that the effectiveness of staff when they feel under duress or under pressure is much reduced over a team that feeling confident and that they know what they need to do and that their processes while they may need to be adapted, it is it's super important that they feel like they can be they've got the confidence to engage others, that the teamwork and the like is already in place. So, ensuring that these things are tested, and putting them through their paces against the behaviors of adversaries can be a massive advantage in trying to enhance and improve the position and confidence that they can be ready. And one of the things that we do in order to drive that is through our incident response services. We're going out into organizations and testing them in advance. We don't, through our incident response retainers, just sit back and wait for an event to occur. We work continuously with our customers for them to consume the hours that they've retained to improve upon the position, so that when an incident occurs, they feel confident and that they know that the problems have already been identified and already been fixed. We know that by having greater visibility across the environment, they feel more prepared as well. That that gap in visibility is a blind spot, and people feel exposed by that lack of visibility, as well as as well as us knowing that it's a challenge in terms of detecting a threat even occurring. People worry about how they're going to respond during those incidents. Engaging a wider group of personas during these exercises can also help a lot with the team relationships and that feeling of preparedness. You're involving more and more field technicians as well as the key executive decision makers. You need to know that the field technicians feel that they know what to do should they go out there. Many of them will be much more than just a cybersecurity responder. Many of them are control systems engineers, commissioning engineers. These are people who absolutely know what it is like to respond to an incident, but in many cases they're an expert in what they're responding to. Now we're asking them to go out there and be the eyes and ears, to another cybersecurity specialist. So, making them feel involved, making them feel prepared, can really help with those things. It's about the procedures, the people, and making sure that all of those things are aligned. And multiplying against that, by having a capability, like our Dragos platform, combined with with the incident response services, using the platform to help understand where the gaps might be, can really help with a continuous cycle of improvement, and really building upon the challenges that people have and turning them into opportunities for really prioritized actions. And just really to summarize, we're looking across those key points. We can absolutely see that there are still visibility gaps, and that the lower down you go within the Purdue model, the greater the level of blindness to those operational issues that might be occurring and any threats that might be manifesting. So still a significant focus is required for people to see that visibility as a priority, and things that need to be pushed down into these spaces are they need people need to be given the impetus to do that, and we're seeing that through emerging regulation. We've seen that sometimes during during the implementation of these technologies, people are doing because they feel it's the right thing, but they run out of momentum. But where regulation requires this kind of visibility, it's really driving things forward. We've seen that having ICS-specific threat intelligence, there's still not enough organizations able to consume that and able to operationalize it in a really productive way. So that, and it can be a hugely significant advantage in this environment. And then finally, people being prepared. Having really good preparedness in this space, can really help to advance the maturity that organizations have. And when those things occur, it really helps people to have the right level of confidence that they can minimize the disruption to their organizations. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Phil. And for our panel, I'll ask that Rich and Simeon both bring themselves back onto camera and to mic. Really looking forward to this discussion. For those who have never seen me host a panel, and this will be a surprise, hopefully not for the panelists, but my idea on a good panel is that this is an opportunity, right? This is a window into a conversation that many people would otherwise never be able to see anywhere else. And so if we do this right, we'll have some really good conversation. I would like to be able to start off with a actually dramatic and hopefully question that you will all disagree on, because I think out of disagreement, we'll probably have a really good dialogue. And that will be sort of, Phil, you ended on this note where one of the highlights that you had was sort of a discussion between the lack of visibility or detection as we went lower into the Purdue levels, right? From Purdue level 3, we're at 20%. We get down to 2, we're at 10%. And I will say, like, this is the first year that SANS asked the sort of questions for those type of capabilities across the entire Purdue model. I am unaware, and somebody, if you know it in chat or if you know it on the panel, of any other survey that has actually asked on a Purdue level basis certain capabilities like that. Does it need to be 100% everywhere? I already sort of stated my opinion that it doesn't, but what does that look like? Does it need to be prioritization? Is it prioritization of sites, of remote areas? Is it capabilities or impact driven? Like, what are the things that we need to look for when we say we're going to do more detection, threat hunting, vulnerability management lower into the Purdue model? What does that really mean? And so, Phil, because you brought it up first, and this also gives my other panelists time to shake off the cobwebs from not being on camera for a while. What is your sort of initial reaction to that?
Yeah. I think it's important that we start to think about monitoring those areas, and certainly when we start to think about level 1 assets, there are not a significant number of threats that we know about today that are targeting those. But we do know of many threats that have gone from level 4 to level 3 and had an impact. We saw that in Ukraine in 2015. We saw then, the following year that moved down to level 2. And then we have seen, since then, attacks on safety systems that are down at level 2, level 1 as well. And so we are seeing this trend lower down within the environments. But it's also very difficult to identify a trend where you don't have any visibility. It's the that old adage, you can't see what you're not looking for. And so the idea that there isn't anything statistically to show that we don't need it yet is quite challenging. But we do know as engineers that in order to physically get to those lower down levels, you usually have to go through something. So this idea that we need to have duplicated monitoring on the analogs in case somebody affects the level 0 digital device or the level 1 digital device is kind of ridiculous. It is about the steps that an adversary needs to take to go through the kill chain. They're not just going to skip to the final step, and that's the only place we should have visibility. So the prioritization is quite right. Actually, we should never say we don't need IT monitoring, because it's OT is more important. IT is the way that people are predominantly getting into OT. there's still not that much evidence that USB-based threats are that significant, but we know they're possible ever since Stuxnet. So it's there, it's possible, but what are the priorities? And it ultimately has to come down to risk, an understanding of the architecture, and thinking about how a threat can actually manifest. And once you've done that, I think hopefully people will start to see that there's many more routes that people can get straight to layer 2 of the Purview model. It is not an architecture, it's a classification. So we're seeing, in many cases now, in particular with the emergence of smart manufacturing and AI-driven data analysis systems, that people are building connectivity to many different points there, and I think that will also drive the need to have lower level monitoring within this space.
I think so one of the things you sort of talked through was the attacker perspective of it, right? And could an attacker go for the level 0, level 1 devices? Sure, but the operator workstation is operator, and it's a Windows XP system. The path of least resistance would probably dictate that I would go after the engineering workstation before I'd go further down that level. So I like that idea of sort of the prioritization based off the attacker discussion. Simeon, how about you? From that graph, when you saw like, oh, here's the Purdue level, here are all the capabilities, does everything need to be more blue? Is it going to be more of a risk-based discussion, or how should people approach this concept of we're lacking capabilities further down the stack?
Yeah, I think ultimately the controls and threat vectors need to be aligned, right? In most realities, level 2 and level 1 will likely require physical access, right? Most of the network and cyber threats will come from level 4 down to levels 3, 2, and 1. So in my perspective, I think having good, say, threat detection and like good and cybersecurity practices at level 3, level 4 is definitely important. I think inventory and visibility from like what you actually have, what the limitations are, levels 1 to 2 are probably more important, and having more inventory based, I would say, controls there, and having more of like risk management elements for those levels. Whereas levels 3 and 4, I think, maybe leaning more into threat detection and leaning more into those elements are probably more important, because that's ultimately where the vector of attack is most likely to come from. And, we're playing a game of, probabilities, not like certainties. So you have to kind of, put your eggs where you think it's most likely to be safe. In the situation, I think when it talks about threat detection, I think level 3 and 4 are perhaps the most appropriate places for threat detection, and risk management would be a much more sensible strategy down the levels.
I like, so both you and Phil hit like a statistical discussion, which now I'll like put on my data science brain, right? Because we are focusing on things that we can see. We're focusing on things that we can survey in this case as well. And Rich, I know you talked a little bit about this too from a self-assessment perspective, just sort of understanding that if we're not looking, how will we know? Like once the attackers like really starting to pivot to things that are 0 and 1, if we're not looking, when will we know? I think that's like a good future question that we still don't have the answer to. So it comes down to like if the tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. So with that, Rich, I know we had a little bit of debate on this too, because like things we even just said it, good cybersecurity hygiene, even like segmentation being in place may thwart a lot of these problems. But what's your view on the detection, the vulnerability management, threat hunting, pen testing, up and down that Purdue level discussion?
Well, nice job on creating a somewhat controversial question for some OT security vendors about whether we need visibility or not. But no, I mean, we're all in the visibility game, but I do appreciate Phil and Simeon's piece of it. And I will say that I've been on both sides of the fence. And what I'm hearing now is this good versus great type of balance between if I have this great visibility, but then I'm completely overwhelmed with alert signals and I'm not able to prioritize, then that information is really not really actionable, right? So I'm not really defending things. So the good piece of it comes down to the individuals, quite honestly, because it's the operators, it's the corporation that's going to know what their crown jewels are, what the production line is most vital. And and then also protecting from the north, as we talked about, right? So we can go and we can chase that 20-year-old PLC that's on some line that we don't really know. This doesn't have a great, impact from my own, my own company's priority, but it still tells me, and it's alarming every day, right? So there's a balance that's coming about this, and so again, it comes about. You got to, the severity piece of it is important, but it's also the prioritization within your within your entity about what is most important and the focus on those. And then when I say focus on it, it isn't a matter, I mean, one, you need, to defend and make things actionable, but you've also got to look across that kill chain, right? I mean, doing the simple things is not comprehensive, and the sophistication, if we get into like the nation states piece of it, is that they're going to quickly move around that, right? So the when we look at the visibility, quite often it's the patching piece of it. And yes, patches are super important, and we all would like to wave our operational wand, but we know it's not Patch Tuesday at OT. So you mentioned segmentation, so compensating controls. So if I've identified it through visibility and I've prioritized it through my own operations piece of it, am waiting to patch. What are the other things that I can be doing, right? And this is actually where our IT friends can help, right? Like, so coming in with the segmentation, micro segmentation, maybe even deception techniques. Can I bring in network behavioral monitoring to see if there's anything anomalous in a fairly static OT environment? There's a lot of other things that we can do to incrementally mitigate risk around those most vital things. So that's the good piece of it. Whereas if we are myopically focused on just going and getting visibility on everything, we're not going to be building those moats around the castle, right? So that's where that balance comes in.
So I want to stick with you then for a minute there, Rich, because I think that one of the things that you really talked about was sort of like looking at that incident response data, right? And this idea that, incidents that are taking place are more normal than they were before, right? We sort of highlighted that 1 in 5 respondents had an incident that would impact ICS and OT. What's your sort of opinion on then improving readiness as a result of that?
Well, I mean, that also goes back to the threat intelligence piece of it. I mean, so we've got to have much more information coming in, and then the response part of it has got to be tailored, right? We can't, again, sit back and just kind of throw generic IT tools into an OT space, right? If they're not able to operate at the protocol level, then they're essentially blind to that,
Mm.
right? So the it has to be a comprehensive view, and this is where, I'll turn to the MITRE ICS matrix, right? In order to kind of heat map out those kill chain and those tactics, in order to focus our area and be finite with OT tools that actually prevent against those, different TTPs. So this goes into that maturation piece of it, right? That we're all experiencing right now. We need to have visibility, we need to have segmentation, but then we need to also quickly evolve. But we have to have that OT focus and support, because without it, again, we're running blind.
So interesting sort of aspect on that is how are we tying things back to operations? And Simi, I'll pivot to you because I know you had a really sort of highlighting on the BCDR capabilities, right? So like, how are we linking those things back to BCDR? And does that change our response, right? Like if we acknowledge that business continuity in a plant environment is a mature aspect of what the plant does, are there hooks? Are there ways for us to get better at that? Sort of as you look at the statistic, what was the thing that jumped out at you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the organizations that have a concept of growth and a concept of a program from a CPS perspective tend to have, better business continuity and disaster recovery also planned. What I've seen over the last couple of years now is, having a maturity framework in-house and having goals for the future really does start to align the organization into more, like business continuity conversations around the OT elements, right? Oftentimes, folks in this space, I think sometimes, quite frankly, rush too much into tech, right? It's too much about, do I need a firewall here? Do I need a clarity solution there? And not enough, okay, what do we want to do in 3 years? Right. And what does recovery look like if X, Y, and Z happens? So those who are more aligned to a programmatic approach and something that has phases and goals attached to those phases, I'm seeing them quickly align away, not just from the tech, but leveraging the tech to say we need to get to this point at this stage in time. So those who actually have time-centric or time-bound goals, and they have defined internal phases of what those goals represent. I'm seeing them actually get to, I mean, you can call the phase 1 to 5, A, B, C, but around somewhere in the middle, those who actually have these goals start to, get better at the business continuity, start to actually incorporate OT into disaster recovery. They move beyond the tabletop exercises and really start to have these conversations and figure out, hey, what does the tech actually enable us to do from an outcome and a goal perspective. I think that's where you start to see, I will say, the top players really start to shine and have clear, defined definition of where they're going to be, say, at the end of the year. And this is where you also see like the C-suite also start to really lean in, because now it's much more like programmatic, and they can actually, have, board level conversations about where the operations are going, as opposed to those who are still too, I would say, tech centric, and they're still too like threat detection and still too Purdue centric, but rather those who are moving towards like a reduction in risk or moving towards like a business continuity by X phase, they're seeing far greater success than others.
That's interesting because as I think through the history of where we are sort of in cybersecurity journeys, but also just broadly in ICS, a lot of the things that we started doing, like tabletops, for example, came from FEMA here in the States, where they were already doing hurricane preparedness drills and say, well, what if we had injects, but the injects were cyber related? And then just the growth that happens with that. I remember one organization I worked with had like an aha moment when they looked at the BCDR plan and it said, well, our recovery time objective, to use what you're just talking about with time, the recovery time objective for this server and this application is going to cost us 2 hours. And the team was like, if that goes down, it's a full bare metal restore. We can't do that in 2 hours. And so the disconnect of what could already be in those plans may not be the reality of what you're seeing actually in ICS security.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's it. And so hence why the programmatic approach and like phased approach of that has like clearly defined goals becomes like the real accelerator of, getting to the maturity that most organizations ultimately want to get to.
Yeah, interesting. And so, Phil, just to pull that thread a little bit more, because I know that you've worked a lot and been exposed a lot to sort of incident response in ICS and OT. What are the differences that you see there when we're looking at like OT in particular, incident response? Like, what are the things that we really need to be paying attention to compared to, again, that quote from DHS saying, if you use your IT plan, it could have disastrous consequences in your OT. What does that mean, and how do we sort of make better with that, tying in some of these operational disparities from BCDR or otherwise? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh,
It's bound to happen.
error. Yeah. Firstly, it's about this recognition that many of the organizations that are operating OT, the idea of doing incident response is far from new to them. It's just new in the cyber sense. Power companies, during a hurricane know how to go and respond to it. The mobilization efforts in response to major weather events or any other kind of equipment failure. These are long tried and tested approaches. The command structures are in place, the communications methods are in place, to everything from a complete nationwide blackout, through to major weather events. So, given the only thing we're really changing is that there's now an adversary who has intent, because weather doesn't have intent, system stability doesn't have intent, but cyber actors do. And that requires a slight change in shift in culture. But apart from that, everything else is there. So rather than thinking that this is something completely new, what we need to do is normalize cyber as part of all of those other engineering processes. And I think I've seen a big shift over the last 10 years or more in this industry between there being, firstly, there'd be some sort of cyber guru that came along to every organization has a CISO. And then, 5 years ago, it would probably just be each organization was lucky to have one OT expert, and they were OT cyber god. And now organizations have normalized that, and ownership and responsibility for cyber resilience sits more and more often within the business. They don't want to pass it across to some other, cyber czar. What they want is for it to be part of their everyday risk calculation. It's in their engineering failure mode analysis. It's there in their everyday work, and because of that, we can start to bring together the skills that are needed. Throwing an IT process at something can be catastrophic, but actually building on the existing operational, environment, experience, the OT skill sets, the engineers who know how to program the devices, they know what the right software is to do that, they know how to back up those things. They're the ones that are going to know how to restore it as well. They know the operational constraints, the safety impacts. So it's engaging those, those teams and bringing them on that same journey and enhancing what's already there, but making sure that it is a specific plan for the operational environment. It's really quite vital.
Is already, I think there's a thread for those in the audience to sort of pick through on this idea of processes, people, and technology, and sort of how it is that you're using all three of them, right? And it may not be technology dependent, but maybe technology is providing you some insights. And if you had people who are well trained or who understood the problems, they'd be able to tell you what technology to get next. But the processes then to be able to be mature, to use Rich, your conversation on maturity levels previously. So that's definitely one thread to pull through, I think, for audience members. I'll ask a couple questions, sort of keeping an eye on time. We have about 10 minutes left, but I want to ask some for the whole group. And again, I encourage you to disagree with your peers where you think it's most relevant. And so I'll start with you, Simeon, on the conversation point, because I think we hit it a couple times on OT has limited resources, right? Like it's not the same thing as IT in a lot of cases. And I know that we've seen this shift now where there's more centralized governance that's taking place. That was a key theme in the 2025 or 2024 survey that we did last year. What's the sort of thing that they should do? What should they focus on from a team perspective? Where's the best bang for the buck or the best return on investment that they could do when you're resource constrained in these environments?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jason. I think, honestly, oftentimes it's going back to the basics and ensuring that you have two pieces, which is, the people, the process, well, three pieces, the people, the process, and tech. I think from a tech perspective, the first thing to really honestly focus on is around the visibility and the insights. The notion you can't protect what you can't see still very much exists. And to perhaps pick, again, going back to the program approach, the right program, which is ultimately is a process and people conversation to ensure that you have the right phases in place. What I've seen, for example, in I would say cash-strapped organizations is they first pick visibility across their core sites. Around the risk management elements, they focus on things like device purpose and business impact, right? To understand, okay, well, a PLC A and PLC B from a physical perspective are just PLCs.
Right.
However, if you are, a dairy producing manufacturer, the milk receiving line matters a lot more than, say, like the weighing machine at the very far end of your process, right? So understanding the device purpose, that level of visibility, ultimately is the foundation of any true cyber program, right? So I think when it comes to visibility, it's not just about, hey, which assets do I have? What PLC do I have? It's building your operations and building your ICS OT security program around ways that are measurable. So for example, phase one could be we need visibility to the point where we understand the device purpose and the business impact of all our assets. I think that's a good stopping point for phase one. Phase two can become more of, okay, now that we understand the business impact, perhaps it's about risk management over the next, X amount of years. It's having both the foundational visibility to understand exactly what the device purposes are, not from like I'll call it techie world, but rather from a device purpose and a business impact perspective, and then having a clear understanding of how you want to reduce that risk over an extended period or over a marked period of time. I think when you're cash strapped, those are the two things I would perhaps focus on, because those actually relate back to the business, and visibility for the sake of tech and for the sake of OT-ness means nothing. It's visibility for the sake of business protection and operational continuity, and then having like a methodology or a framework that ensures it's measurable and it's outcome driven, so that in X years you aren't still just going through your visibility exercises, but rather you can map to say, okay, I now have a clear visibility around business impact across Y assets across the business. So that's what I would focus on if I was cash strapped and really wanted to make a difference.
That's what I really love about that. And it's one of the things that we teach in the 2-day management course, ICS 418, which is how do you relate back to the business? Because if you talk to any technology leader, they're typically really good about talking about the technology. Talking about the business seems to struggle a little bit depending on sort of where they came from, right? It's not something that we imbue upon them. Hey, you're now going to be a new manager for ICS-OT security. Do you know how the revenue structure of your organization works? Probably not a top 10 thing that they get asked. And so it requires them to become a technologist as well as sort of a business sort of acumen sort of needs to be imbued into them at the same time. So I think it's an interesting set of challenges. And I was hoping for disagreement, but I feel like, Rich, with your conversation on maturity models in particular, I don't know if I'm going to get much disagreement on this question, but where do you think that sort of return on investment, the best bang for the buck could happen if you're talking about a resource-constrained ICS OT team? You go to a plant, what do you sort of work with them on?
Well, I showed levels of maturity and Simeon talked about phases. So I'm going to use Simeon's terminology, but I would point towards phase 0. And this is really embracing the IT teams, right? I mean, the cavalry is coming. Do they have the operational experience? No, but that's your job. So your job is to teach them and show them, and again, going back to the revenue lines and that type of thing. But I mean, that conveyor belt actually is what keeps the lights on, right? And so they also have their shared priorities, right? And so once you get those combined and the folded arms relax and you realize that we're actually on the same team, I think that is probably going to be the biggest, intangible, but is going to lead to that ROI because again, we don't have the people, we don't have maybe necessarily the budget, but our IT folks do. And so how can we best collaborate on that? And it starts with that priority piece of it. So we can then get on, as I mentioned before about specific OT tools and what have you. We've talked Purdue model. There's IEC 62443. There's other compliance reports against them. I mentioned the CIS top 20 with the implementation guide. But there are ways that we can report out as IT folks are used to in order to fuel that ROI conversation. And so that's the opposite end of, making sure that we're all playing nice is that what are we implementing in order to fuel the next ROI conversation? Because the first investment is going to happen, right? Just as I talked about with that OT risk, all of a sudden shot up to the board. Now what do we do? Well, okay, what do? We throw money at it, resources, and then it's going to be now what, right? So we've got to measure, it's got to move, right? And that goes to the ROI piece of it. So kind of jumped from the spectrum, which is like make sure that your teams are aligned. I mean, I've seen customers. One CISO said, "Well, we're just going to kick the door down." It's like, I don't know if I would go that way. And so but we've seen companies that have gone that extra step to get alignment, to get the teams oriented on their common goals, that they're able to progress quicker. And so when you progress quicker, it's less spend, it's more effectivity at the end of that. And then I would just stress that you've got to measure along the way, right? Yes, it's OT. Yes, it's a bit different, but we're making an investment. What's that return? And then let's prepare ourselves for the next round of investment.
I am not doing a good job of getting controversy on this panel.
I
Bill,
mentioned there is no phase 0.
I
just pointed out,
disagree
right?
with that,
Okay, so
Jason.
I'm improvising here.
Jason, I disagree with your inability to get competition. Okay?
I disagree with whatever Phil has to say next.
Yeah, I vehemently disagree with it.
This is awesome. So phasing, absolutely, right? Being able to have your people process technologies, build those phases. What I also, Rich, really liked about that last sort of discussion is metrics. People who know my background from the government and standard development organizations, working on C2M2 maturity model analysis and crawl, walk, run approach, but also like if you're not keeping score, you're just practicing, right? Like we're not actually able to improve if we don't know where we are. So Phil, is there anything that we're missing here? If we're going into sort of this idea of what's the biggest impact, what's the return on investment, but it's a resource constrained team, where do your thoughts go when we talk through that?
So I often think about these in terms of which resources are actually constrained, because more and more, depending on the organization you go into, Sometimes it's the people, sometimes it's the money, sometimes it's the physical access to the systems themselves.
Oh, yeah.
And and so we can often find that then when people start to think about, okay, I've got a lot of money, I've gone out, I've hired a big team, I'm going to do this work, they're then constrained by some other external force, whether it's I can't get an outage in a substation, I can't shut that line down, I can't physically get to do the work. And because we see more and more that extra constraint there, people then take that programmatic approach and think, well, I've got about 20 different things I want to do to that line. Well, when it comes out, I want to put an IDS in it. Or while I'm doing that, if I'm going to update this switch, I might as well update the firmware on it. Oh, does it even have the ability to take the latest firmware? Let's replace the switch. Oh, while we're on, let's update the firmware and all the PLCs. And oh, that HMI's got an out-of-date version of Windows. Let's move it to Windows 11. Oh, the software doesn't run. Let's put that. And so it constantly compounds. And actually, sometimes we miss the simple thing. And the analogy I often use is that if you asked an electrical engineer to build a house in the middle of a field, they'd form a committee of about 10 people to decide whether they should put a door on the house because is that an appropriate way of accessing the property, and maybe there's a better way of getting in. And then they would certainly debate the need for a lock because they'd want to know the statistics of all the houses that have been built in that area and if a house had ever been burgled in that field before they actually invested in a lock. Now, how many people build a house without putting a lock on the door? You put it there, and not having a lock on the door is not about nobody makes that decision not to put a lock on the door of a house. Now, not putting a lock on the door isn't inviting somebody to come in and take your things, but we do it anyway as a practical control. And how many obvious and practical controls are we still debating putting in these environments? When people are still building new factories and not baking in things that they know they need, and they've already got, quite often already got the technology in another plant that they've retrofitted. So just making the decision to bake these things in, we're still procrastinating a lot over relatively obvious things. We don't always need the stats. I'm a big fan of having the evidence to drive change. But sometimes there are some really obvious things that we should be doing, and we can either dive in and try and do too much work, or we're just not doing enough because we're debating its necessity. And I think that can, finding the middle ground between those two things can really help us, from against the challenge of wasting resources that we have. We are finding people have got budget, they have got the skills, and those people with the skills aren't allowed to enable things in those environments.
That is a good mic drop moment for us, being able to understand that the resource constraint may not always be the resource that we think. I really wanted to make sure that we had this last conversation because as people get a report like this, and I think, Rich, you had that commentary when you started your presentation of like, just take a step back, breathe, like where have we gone, what have we been doing? I also want to give people the perspective of if you've not started, right, and you're going to read this report, and we've got over 40 different figures that could be overwhelming to you depending on like where you are in your journey. Where to start, how to prioritize is super important, super critical. You're not going to boil the ocean, you're not going to get everything, Rome's not built in a day type of conversation. So thank you to the panelists and the sponsors for being able to be on this first panel, really setting the stage now that we're going to have for some of these future conversations that we have throughout the rest of the day. So panelists, thank you very much. Phil, Rich, Simeon, really appreciate the conversation, kicking us off here. With that, we are going to go into a 15-minute break for everybody. So we'll come back at 12:30 Eastern time. And when we come back, we'll get into our next set of presentations, followed by our last two panels. So see everybody in about 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you. All right, and as we come back, would like to introduce Emir. So again, we're going into another set of panel discussions. So thank you very much, Emir, for joining us. Associate Professor of Computer Science at Emory University and CTO for Keystrike. I like how you say that you're a reformed hacker there and system builder. You previously had founded Syndis, an adversary, also a public speaker, educator, pianist, private pilot, and probably your most proud thing would be the father of four. His research has been supported by the NSF, CDC, Uranus, and others, and he's passionate about passing his knowledge to students and to fellow builders. Also, in looking you up, we were at Cornell and grad programs at the exact same time. So we may have met each other at like Tell Grads It's Friday out there in Ithaca. So glad to have you being able to kick off our next set of presentations before our next panel. Emir, I hand it over to you.
So glad to be here. Thank you, Jason. Good to meet you again, huh? So I wanted to talk a little bit about my trajectory there. So like I actually started up in cyberspace growing up on the wrong side as a teenager, and then kind of gradually realized it was very much the wrong side. I've been trying to make amends ever since. And a part of that gives me this weird perspective of understanding kind of how the underground works, how these hackers think. And so I've been taking that mindset from that and applying it in both my research, but also just in trying to make things better. So in particular, what I wanted to do is to reflect a little bit about what we're going to move the slides here. Here we go. How we can take these lessons from this amazing survey that you've been putting together and contextualize them from both the perspective of how things are progressing in terms of attacks, but also in terms of our defense. Like let's talk about this juxtaposition here. And one thing I really want to highlight, I just want to like take this little somber moment here just to kind of underscore. We've been saying things for a long time. Of course, cybersecurity are the first to cry wolf, right? And we're talking about all these things, but it's materialized, and it's materializing so fast. The things that we have been heralding and giving warnings for is actually happening. And it's happening at a rate that is unprecedented, right? We're talking about 1 in 5 organizations in this survey experience the cyber incident. Let that sink in for just a moment. Like, do we realize how big this number is? Like, this is like, let's contextualize. Let's draw. Here's 100 different like factories or any type of company that might be making things, or maybe water utilities. All these places that actually are the pillars of our society. Here's 100 of them. And what we're saying is that these were hacked in 2012. They had some cyber incident. And not only that, but if we go even further, then we're saying that 40% of those that had this cyber attack had operational disruption. We're just talking earlier on this panel about like how this translates into money lost, like the conveyor belt stays stopped, like this things grind to a halt. Remember Jaguar that just had this major cyber attack on its IT systems. They went down. They had losses of 1.9 billion pounds as a consequence of a cyber attack because they had to disrupt the supply. Like taking those conveyor belts offline has massive consequences. And we know that this is what feeds the bills. This is what happens. But not only this, we also had direct financial and data loss from these cyber attacks, 13%. Like this is like I'm highlighting them in red right here. Just how many there are. This is the number of companies. If we walk around our neighborhood and see 100 different companies, like this is how many had financial and data loss. If we extrapolate from the survey, and 8% had safety risks. Let's just underscore that for just a second. Like this is insane. This is so high. This is so unacceptably high. On so many fronts. This is why we are on this call. This is why we do what we do. This is why SANS exists. This is why you're here, right? It's because this is not acceptable. We must do better. We have an imperative to do better. So what can we actually meaningfully do? Like, well, let's study the problem. And that's why I'm so happy to see the survey and what came into it. And one of the things that's highlighted in the survey is that 70%. Actually, this is not the way it's highlighted. It's that like it only took 24 hours to death. But actually, let's flip that on its head. It did take more than 6 hours for 70% of the survey respondents to detect the attack. Why is that meaningful? Well, it's an improvement over what was. It's a shift in the distribution. But what we're also seeing is that in parallel, hackers are moving faster. The average time to break out from your first vantage point, from your first initial access point, is 48 minutes. That's the CrowdStrike report for all of last year. 48 minutes, that's the average. The fastest they saw it, like that first lateral movement, 50 seconds. We are trying to catch up, but we're in an arms race. So we make progress, but the adversary is also making progress at the same time. And that's what makes this so infuriating. We actually need to do a lot more, a lot faster, with a lot less. That's our predicament. That is the Gordian knot that we need to be able to solve. We must be able to do that because things are not progressing in the right direction fast enough. Okay? So what do we do? If we think about this distribution I was talking about, 7% took more than 6 hours. Compounding that even further is that there are incidents where it didn't even take hours or days. In fact, there were incidents that took months to resolve. There were incidents that even took years to resolve. This is mind-boggling. This is taking some fully functional business and just taking it on its side, right? Like this is disrupting operations for long enough that it's very meaningful. Like we need to be able to help as many of these organizations live this. Now, of course, a lot of the big incidents happen with smaller, less resourced organizations, but there's so much to do here. But I just wanted to highlight this point here is that we need to be able to detect things as fast as possible because the adversary is moving in that direction. Things are becoming automated. We're seeing it more and more. And the lowest fruit is very much close to the ground these days. All right, okay, so the pain is real. If we now think about what this report brings to our table here, if we have to do more with less, the only real answer we have is to prioritize, right? Like we need to figure out what is actually important here. And that's an interesting question. And for those of you who read the report, it is an interesting thing to ponder. Like, what does it really tell us about what we should be doing? There are, in parallel, many things that we should be doing a little bit different. It's informative. There are some trends that are in the right direction. There's a lot of confluence that's going up. But meaningfully, what is different about how we should approach our cybersecurity programs, if anything? And that's what I wanted to drill into a little bit, right? What is it that really needs the most attention here? And what really caught my attention here is something that, so we keep hammering on this fact that like we want compliance, but compliance is not security, right? And that is true to a large extent. Like compliance lags behind security because of that arms race that we were just talking about, right? But there is something that is interesting good news in here, which is that there's something causally linked with what regulated organizations are doing, the 58% of course that are regulated. They had the same number of incidents, same fraction of incidents, which is interesting in and of itself. It says something about how the distribution is uncorrelated. But when they had incidents, they had 50% less impact. Something is going right when it comes to what organizations do when they implement these regulations. We're doing something right there. So I just wanted to also highlight that because we often keep bashing compliance for having issues. Yeah, we implement it, but we don't equate it with full security because, yeah, it's lacking, it's lagging, all sorts of issues. But there is something here about it being the right beacon, especially for the laggards in the group here. Okay? So if we have that, we can look at what these regulated orgs are really doing and dive into that. And that survey also does a great job of distilling that. And really what it finds is that there's this maturity curve of sorts that really has like three main categories. There's you're spending time on visibility, which we've talked about in the conversations quite a bit. You need to know what's going on in your organization to know where to mount any type of defense. And then there's remote access, which we'll talk about a little bit. And then there's of course monitoring for what's going on. If we think about that in terms of where we can get the biggest return on investment here, it really boils down to remote access. This is our weakest link. It is the choke point between attackers and what we're trying to protect, if we think about it, right? It is the root cause of 50% of the incidents, like the number one root cause of 50% of the incidents. And if we look at other reports, I'm just going to bring in the data and think about it for a second. We know at least implicitly, and we have the data and stats and everything to back it up, that a lot of these OT attacks, they originated from somewhere in IT. There was some chain, there's some attack chain, and it all kind of funneled through maybe a jump box or something where an attacker went through, and then they got into the OT environment, right? Now, there are caveats here. There's 5G connected sensors and so forth, but this is a huge statistic, and it simply means that we are now seeing a little bit more of why remote access is so critical of a component in our cybersecurity program here, and that we need to address. So let's look at that a little bit more. So if it's the root cause here, and we think about the maturity of the organization, then we saw that segmentation is already reasonably or moderately implemented by 60% of organizations. And then we have remote access here. And then we look at further in the distribution here, these advanced defenses where we're kind of logging everything and so on, because that's less than 15%. So this is kind of where we are in that maturity curve. This means that our focus, our laser focus, we haven't done it so far, but where we can get the biggest bang for the buck is really here, making sure that we are securing remote access, right? We're seeing now more of the attacks. We know this is the choke point that pass through. This is the stuff we can get disproportional leverage to patch. And we should be doing that, right? There's a lot of things we should be doing, but if we just think of a prioritization, like this ought to be very high on the list from all these stats that we see. And that's something that we've been thinking about for a long time. In fact, I was thinking about this in my lab at Emory. And the question was, if you already are providing remote access, you already have it in place, it's already there, somebody's able to use their skills from afar and get into that water pump or get into that manufacturing, but whatever it might be through some computer, there's a concentration of experience that is now kind of in a small population. So like remote access is only going to get more and more important for a lot of these aging technologies. So you already have it in place that somebody can remote in. What if you could just secure it? We often take these big convoluted things where to shift everything out, change all the workflows, and replace it. But what if you could just take whatever you're currently doing, just make it secure? Like what if you had a magic wand that could just do that? And that's the question we're asking in the lab. And we're asking from the perspective of an attacker, like what is it about attacks that make it so easy to pass through remote access? And that has to do with tokens and various things. It's about the fact that authentication isn't really enough. Like you authenticate, but we don't really know if you stay you. It's easy to take over these sessions. It's easy to ride along. It's easy to do impersonations, all sorts of things that are wrong with that. What we decided to do instead was this idea, which is to say every command that is entered into your OT environment has to have been physically made by an employee, even on that remote computer, even if the computer is hacked. That's the idea. It's this super simple idea. Just verify intent. If you do that, you now have a really easy solution. Doesn't change any workflows. It covers like 80%, which is one of the most remote access solutions of like the controls that we have here. It's really strong on SIP 005R2. It takes about 20 minutes to deploy in like big water facilities. It's used in 35 countries. This is something that can get you a lot for so little. And we really want to patch this particular hole here. I'd love to talk more about it. Confirm intent. That's what we are about. You have authentication, you have authorization, which tells you who can do what, who someone is, but we want to verify that what was happening in practice was intended by you and your employees. Thank you very much.
Emir, thank you so much for setting the stage. I love the delivery. I love the. I'm gonna take the animations you did. Those are fantastic. I'm gonna get like that factory burning on safety. It really does draw the conversation. And I like how you're already helping us set the stage as we get into this next panel, where before we're talking a lot about detection and visibility. Now let's talk about the impacts. Now let's talk about some of the most common ways that people are getting in, and remote access being one of them. So I'll invite you to come back to our panel at the end of our presentations. But next up is going to be James Turner. James Turner comes from OPSWAT. He's a senior solutions engineer for OT security at OPSWAT, where he supports critical infrastructure organizations in strengthening cyber resilience across energy and manufacturing sectors. With a background that spans electrical systems, industrial automation, education in cybersecurity. James will bring a practical understanding to both engineering and operations and the evolving threats facing OT environments. James, welcome very much. Thank you for being on camera and with your mic on. I'll leave it to you, and we'll take away from there and get into our panel shortly.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you, and congratulations on the paper. Amazing. Again, this is something I look forward to every year. This is just a great piece of information and a great piece of data to help overall the industry, right? I mean, in the end, we're here to help each other, and I'm so grateful for SANS, and even looking back to where some of these things came from. Mike Asante, right? Fighting the good fight. This is what really matters to him, right? And I'm glad that we continue to engage in his vision. So with that said, I think one of the things that we spent some time on and we've talked about a lot is, okay, 1 in 5, right? This is a big number. And following the discussion here, yeah, it's a large quantity when you put it in perspective. And honestly, last night I was thinking about how I can present this in such a way that made sense, and I'm so glad I followed. I'm so glad I followed Keystrike on this conversation, because they really set the stage. They put it in perspective. 1 in 5, right? Which ultimately says something too. It says that ICS or OT attacks are real. They're not hypothetical. These are not academic exercises that we're talking about. These are real incidents. And what's interesting, and maybe Jason, here's an opportunity for us to have a little controversy, right? So I know you're looking for something to discuss around it. Is some of those statistics are about those incidents are still 30% ransomware, or greater than 30% ransomware, and greater than 30% as far as like malicious code detections, right? 50% was the unauthorized access, but we're still talking about files, right? This is something that, if we go back to the analogy of, the house with a door, the files are getting into these systems. How are they getting there, right? This is the real question. And what kind of controls, I guess you could say this is the lock that is necessary in order for us to move files into the system, right? So who has the ability, and how are these files getting into these environments? And as stated, in 40% of these incidents were actually causing operational disruptions. That is an astronomical number. And what that speaks to is that ultimately this is a business existential problem, right? Not just an IT problem, not just an OT problem. This is an existential business problem. And so ultimately, how are defenders responding to this reality? This is where things get interesting, right? When we integrate threat intelligence into controls and workflows, defenses become a little bit more actionable. And in the survey, we see an increase in ransomware, OT ransomware targeting, right? And it's no surprise that as a result, 72% of the respondents said that they were preparing specifically for OT ransomware scenarios. But with that said, we're also talking about nation-state threats, an increase in nation-state threats, and I went a little too far. That double click happens pretty quick. Nation-state threats, and supply chain compromises are other planning exercises, right? But ultimately, this is all around this common thread that I saw in the report, and the survey was really focused around threat intelligence. And I'll get a little philosophical here, and I apologize in advance, but I've said before, threat intelligence, really the poetry language of cybersecurity, right? We all understand the raw words. We understand IPs, we understand hashes, we understand TTPs, but it's the context for the operators. It's their reality, right? They are the ones who are experiencing it, so it is their poetry. Right? They know exactly what's happening. They have a feel for it, and they are the ones who are able to put context to these IP hashes and TTPs, right? And I guess scroll does a movement as well. And my apologies. But ultimately, what we should be doing, or what we should be making sure that we're thinking about, is really leveraging our own poetry. We've experienced this, and we know what we're experiencing in the moment. We know how it feels. We are in crisis. We're dealing with these things, right? So, making sure that we are producing our own threat intelligence is a critical function, I think, for security, right? So making sure that it's not just another feed. For operators, it's a narrative. Now, one of the ways that we are helping, or we're seeing in the industry, some improvements in threat intelligence really revolve around sandboxing. Now, what's interesting here is now we're talking about files, right? So this is that controversial thing, because we've been talking about all these things before, about visibility and about segmentation and all of these things, but they're really focused on the network. And I think we may be missing this, the lock on the door, right? How are these files moving in the environment, and what are we doing to detect, right? It's not just about AVs, and it's not just about examining things for malware or YAR rules. It's about the possibility of doing detonation of that file. What is it doing? So I would say a good example of a sandboxing pipeline would include, examination of a file, which included, reputation. So what do we know about this file? Have we seen it before? And then doing dynamic analysis. Let's do some detonation. Let's do some evaluation of what this file is. And then let's produce a score. Is this bad? Is this good? And then from there, we can additionally add some context to it around, have we seen this before? So now we get better information, even within our own environments, about the attacks that are actually occurring in our environments. Are we seeing IP addresses that are relative to our environment, right? That tells us there's a direct attack occurring. I mean, and not to say that threat feeds are not important, because they are. They're just a component to it, right? So being able to get it from CISA, being able to get it from vendors, being able to get it from government agencies, those are important. But I do think that we're missing out, because in the survey, I believe it was 21.6%, or I'm sorry, 27% that actually showed that they were generating their own threat intelligence. I think there's a good opportunity. So of course, back to the statement though, none of this really works without visibility, and so that also happens in the network, right? We see communications between assets. We need visibility into those. When we look at visibility across the ICS cyber kill chain, again, 12.6%, that's incredibly low, right? What was more interesting to me was this 20% full visibility at Purdue level 3. This is where data is concentrating, right? So we're getting all of our data and our process data up into Purdue level 3, yet we only have about 20% visibility in here. And then finally, one of the things that I think, and I took away from the report, was that we do see that there's this mutual dependence between IT and OT. They are mutually dependent on each other, and I'm glad to see that there's this larger increase in it, combined SOCs or parallel IT OT SOCs. I think this is a stride in the right direction. But what's also interesting, though, is that still we have this 7.6% with no integration between IT and OT monitoring. That to me is some place where we obviously have this methodology to improve. But one of the questions I have is, what can we do to improve visibility? And one of the ways that we're seeing customers deploy options for visibility is through data diodes. As strange or as different of an idea as this may be, we do have the ability to get critical process data out of control systems through a separate channel, right? So maybe we're always able to look at our critical process data, and maybe we also have the ability to always have visibility in instances where we don't necessarily need control. But in instances where we do need control, maybe we do have an industrial firewall that understands the OT protocols. Maybe that industrial protocol has some sensors or some visibility options within it. But maybe this is our right path, or maybe this is our control or remote access control path. This is how we are able to write into the control system. And maybe there's already assets there that exist. Your industrial firewalls are already in place, but maybe it's okay to put in an alternative path for critical data acquisition so that if one day during incident response we need to contain, can we contain without losing visibility? And the answer is yes. We can remove the function, the ability to remote access in and produce our data out. I know it's a little bit of a paradigm shift, but there's nothing that says that we have to have our data acquisition channels and our control channels in the same pathway. So it's definitely the concept of separating the control from the visibility and process data. I mean, but if there's one place that we're still consistently seeing organizations struggle is in secure remote access, right? I think this is going to get hammered pretty hard. 50% remote access. Unauthorized remote access. And I think CISA last year had a statistic around the idea of most of it was known credentials, right? So I mean, these things are not as secure as we think they are. And what that means, or what that also shows, is that less than 15% of organizations have advanced remote access controls. That statistic too is interesting to me, but probably the thing that is most interesting for me is the lack of internal resources. So one of the challenges, I think, as far as machine builders and asset owners are concerned, is there's this dual model. One model where I'm the machine builder and I want to produce my machines and put my remote access into it and maintain my service level agreement. And then I've got another model, which is the asset owners who will, divvy out remote access and need remote access into their control systems as well. And so what I think happens, and this green line where we see here, this lack of internal resources, I think that becomes the default. Hey, you know what? I'm going to let the vendor produce their own remote access. And that's, to me, a scary proposition. So I think that kind of stuff needs to come back in-house. I think those things introduce a lot of risk. Now, one thing that we are seeing is the planning around particular attacks. I think this is driven by threat intelligence. Ransomware targeting OT environments being the biggest at 72%. Supply chain compromise and insider threat are the other considerations. But I think the one that's really interesting in this particular slide is this AI-enabled threat automation and impersonation. At 32%, organizations are planning around that. This is very interesting because let's take it in context here. Back in 1997. Deep Blue, IBM's Deep Blue, beat the Grandmaster World Champion in chess, right? This is AI-driven chess. We look at adversaries doing the same thing and driving that kind of stuff in our OT environment. I think that becomes a very scary and interesting proposition. So I do expect that we'll see a lot more AI-driven defenses in the future, but we will see. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to bring up as I close is we are seeing a use of data diodes also for the ability to not only get our process data out, say our historian replication into Purdue Level 4, but also to back up those critical systems and bring them into a staging and file analysis zone where we can manage how the files are moving in and out of these environments. And we're able to analyze the file over time, right? So we're not just taking a snapshot of what it looks like right now, checking it, sending it on its way. We're saving it. We're keeping forensic copies of what's happened in this environment over time and reanalyzing them with new threat intelligence, sandboxing, and with multiple antiviruses in order to say that this file and this disk image and these configuration files that we use as part of our critical control are okay to move into our disaster recovery zone. Now, when we do that and we bring them into the disaster recovery zone, we see that our customers are building systems ready to run, right? Which ultimately reduces that recovery time objective. So we're already prepared for an event after our containment and eradication have taken place. So with all of that, I think there's one more thing, and I know I'm going a little bit over on my time. There's one more thing I wanted to point out, and I think it's probably the most important. Having been field engineer, having been electrician, having spent my time in the field, the one thing that I thought was very compelling, and it was brought up in this survey, was that 66% were more likely to include field technicians in preparedness exercises were the ones that were the most prepared, right? And this plays into the human psychology. Ultimately, when security isn't somebody's primary job, they think somebody else is working on it, right? Somebody else is looking out for me. But when we involve the field technicians as part of the security team, they become part of that security system, and ultimately it strengthens both their preparation, the organizational preparation, and visibility. So with that, I will close. 2 minutes over. My apologies, but SANS and Jason, thank you so much for all of the hard work.
No worries, James, on the time. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you being able to start off with sort of the recognition on Mike in particular. We have a sort of a principle that Dean and I have called out several times, the Mecasante principle, where he discusses that the only real defense against nation state adversaries that are trying to target our operational technology systems is a workforce, a cybersecurity knowledgeable workforce that has the skills capable to be able to defend. I know that you recently had also just gone through the master's program here at SANS, so that's no small feat by itself. Thank you very much. And I look forward to pulling some of those threads that you were able to highlight in the report when we get into the panel in about 15 minutes. And with that, Ian, you are next up, and I see you on camera and mic ready. So Ian is the co-CEO and co-founder of Dispel, where he leads the design and systems to operate securely and efficiently at scale. An industrial engineer by training, Ian holds a master's from Georgia Tech and a bachelor's from Yale University. He serves as co-chair of the Cyber Standards Committee of the National Defense Industrial Association and is vice president of NDIA's New York chapter. He has contributed to key cybersecurity initiatives as principal investigator on 3 projects for the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, member of the OMAC Working Group for Security Considerations for Remote Access, and editor of NATO's NAIG SG294. I love it when we can do standards numbers into any presentation. This is great already. Report on zero trust in federated environments. Ian, thank you very much. Really looking forward to your presentation, and I'll invite you to stay when you're done with your presentation as we get into our panel.
You bet. And I'm going to I know who put that bio up there. I'm going to get them for that after this is done. Okay. Let's see if I can drive. Okay. First off, we go back. Hi. It's nice to meet you all. Dispel, by way of context, we've been around for 11 years. We are, as of a few weeks ago, the last American-founded, built, and owned firm that is focused exclusively on the problem of remote access to operational technology, which means we're either completely crazy or we may have gotten a couple of things right over the last 11 years. This presentation I was asked to come in here and talk about how, as a tool maker, we are interpreting the results of this survey and how we would be actioning on it. And I want to apologize in advance. I made this, our marketing team did not. So for starters, I want to provide a little bit of a cautionary tale. It also involves SANS. Right before lockdown, SANS had held one of the last in-person events focused on OT security. And up until that point, we had been struggling mightily by taking survey results, which were showing what we thought were the pain points that people really cared about in operational technology, going out to present to companies and saying, right, so we have engineered solutions that solve these problems. And we were not getting sales. When we showed up at this event, we found ourselves in what you would classically find during a conference, which is a lunch line. And in that lunch line, I found myself speaking to a member of one of the big four consultancies. And this gentleman described to me a set of characteristics, which he said, if you build something that addresses these particular solution characteristics for remote access, we believe that this would be a pacing threat against any other remote access system, and we would probably recommend it. And during that same lunch, kept asking the question around of different people. If we actually built these characteristics, would you cut a check for the product? And the answer was repeatedly yes. 54% of the people that we spoke to at that event had follow-on meetings. That one event is how our company survived the lockdown period by getting enough revenue. And it taught me a very important lesson about surveys. People will fill out a survey and say a whole pile of stuff, but if they aren't either A, in person, or B, holding their checkbook, a lot of what they're saying might not really translate into value. So, with that as a comment, let's look at the results of this thing. What did we see? The first thing that was really standing out to me versus 5 years ago is 56% of this respondents said, yeah, we didn't have any known incidents. 22% said, yeah, we had one or more. 15% said, yeah, we probably have one, but we're not going to talk about it. And only 8% said, we don't know. We straight up are unsure of what happened this year. The other thing that was important was when you dug into, okay, well, for those of you who are willing to talk about it, what actually hit you, this set of feedback doesn't stack to 100%, mind you. People were getting hit in a number of different ways. Yes, about half of the responses were saying the way this attack happened was we had an unauthorized external access event. But if you look at the other characteristics of these incidents, ransomware, malicious code, these data loss or modification, these things could well have happened because someone was coming inside of the perimeter. They could have also happened if you had insiders going in and tapping and said, we just don't know. What is pretty clear, though, is that the market respondents have invested enough to have some sense of what the heck is going on inside of their environment. They can see that the proverbial generator is on fire. What they haven't really been doing yet is investing a whole pile of money in putting those fires out. So, not deriving this solely from this survey, but from what we're also seeing in the field, the first step, reacting to, okay, now I can see that there are problems, I'm going to try and address them, is not going to be the textbook one of establishing an asset inventory, conducting a governance model, doing a risk assessment, and then moving onwards. It's probably going to be a reactionary, we have to ring fence this bonfire, and then we can methodically start solving the problem. And by ring fencing it, the action of remote access is going to serve as the control point by which we can, well, one, try and mitigate the threats coming against us, but also start to see the scope of access events that are taking place inside of our environment. This leads to a classic problem between the cybersecurity community, of which we're all members, and then the community of people that are buying remote access most of the time in the first place, which is that remote access is not and never will be a security tool. It's an efficiency tool that happens to have necessary cybersecurity attributes. And cybersecurity, as my CISO loves to say, is math. It is not marketing. So if you want true cybersecurity, you're paying attention to 407 top-line controls in the NIST 882 high baseline. And doing that sort of alignment when you don't have the budget of a federal government is extremely challenging. It's millions of dollars if you're doing it on your own. So what you find yourself as a cybersecurity professional doing is you're saying, okay, I need to contain this bonfire. I need to have controlled access in there. And through that, we're going to get security. And oftentimes what happens is you say security, and a procurement officer hears something completely different from what you're describing. So that takes us to the next topic, which is, okay, well, what's preventing you from actually getting secure remote access, whether or not we can't see under the hood what the definition of secure is that you're using, but what's preventing the implementation of secure remote access controls across an ICS/OT environment? And looking at these things as a tool maker, this is your pull out the list of reasons why you aren't getting a sale and start working this problem so that way you can accelerate a deployment. Okay, what are the things here that changes to the tool can fix? The things that we saw that were the highest point ones were the time, people, money point, as well as legacy system compatibility. Fine. We need to make a system that is readily integrable with pre-existing systems on site. Ideally, they're agnostic to whatever the heck is going on inside of the perimeter. The other thing is they've got to be fast, they've got to be cheap, and they have to reduce the number of administrative hours that go into the remote access process. It's the classic, if it's not easier to use, someone's going to use something else. The thing to also look at if you're in a buyer's chair is if these are the things that are impeding you, realistically, what are the ones that the tool could conceivably fix? If I'm going out and shopping for something, the list of things that I've marked here in orange are characteristics that I would probably want to be putting into my requirements bulletin before going out and looking for something. But there are also things that an implementation team can fix. People, not the tool itself. Organizational misalignment is one which may well just involve one group of people saying, I need remote access, and the other one saying I need a security tool. But also vendor resistance to new systems. This is the classic one of, do you have a good relationship with that third party that's supposed to adjust the air conditioner every season? Or do you not? Because maybe that's something where the remote access vendor can get in the middle and provide the friendly face to those third parties. The thing is, though, you can also solve those particular things, and you probably can solve them better than any tool provider can. So using the same theme of remote access as an efficiency tool with necessary cybersecurity attributes, the thing that we often find is if there is a cybersecurity team that's stuck, they want to secure a system, they genuinely have set up an appropriate architecture, but they aren't getting funding, they need to change how they're talking about remote access. So you switch to talking about improving mean time to recovery, reducing the amount of time that employees and operators are spending in vehicles driving to sites to fix things, speeding up deployments, whether that's at a greenfield or a newly acquired facility, or establishing a common operating picture for the management of the firm. In some parts of the world, one of the best things that we've seen is when people start saying, this will let us change without touching any legacy systems. From a cybersecurity attribute perspective, there aren't that many things you need to put up there that everyone else will understand. The first is, sir, this is going to align you with the standards. I know you were mentioning a couple of keywords. There are 407 controls here. This is green, green across the board. And then the second is, sir, we're keeping you off the news. I just have to have this to fix this particular problem. This then takes me to the survey question, which every tool maker is going to care about, which is, all right, so where has the market already bought a solution? And you'll see this whole long list. I'm not going to reread it out, but the important thing is there are a whole pile of categories where there's over 20% market penetration here. And the deep green is fully implemented, light green is partially implemented. And that is a staggering change from 5 years ago. But this takes us to another problem which exists in the toolmaker community, which is known as the OT cybersecurity sandwich. And that is that in OT cyber, there are three types of products. There are those that perform the asset inventory function. There are those that perform the access control function. And then there are those that do monitoring and response. And there are moments when companies have bridged over into the other zones, but each time you do that, it costs over $100 million to engineer a perfect solution for any one of these verticals. So when you go into another neighborhood, you find yourself competing against someone who's just spent far more resources and time getting that particular zone correct. And since there hasn't been a roll-up across all three of these things, these are still specialized zones. The theory has been that to compete in any one of these zones effectively, you need a solution that covers the entire spectrum of attributes within that particular vertical, whether that's asset inventory, access control, or monitoring and response. It's why many of the other people who were speaking today had so many different features that they were rattling off. If that is really true, and that's what's driving a tremendous amount of expense at each one of these firms, then why in the world is the coverage chart this jagged? The answer, the only reason why that thing is jagged is because people must be buying or building point solutions. We thought they didn't. They clearly are. So for anyone who's watching this who is at a large user of operational technology, you don't need to do this anymore. People have been fighting it out in the market for a decade to build platform-based solutions. So this takes you to the classic observation of platforms versus point solutions. Should you still be doing the thing at home? Should you be home rolling it? If people could have done all this stuff in-house at scale, they would have. I doubt there are very many people on this webinar who are not tinkerers at heart. We've all tried to home roll this, and we probably have pulled it off once or twice. The thing is that this starts to break when you have to do it with 10, 20 people. And what you'll find that's a real indicator that people have focused on the scale problem only at certain segments is everyone's trumpeting as a triumph that they've got multi-factor down at some of their plants, or they've done some network segmentation. But that in practice is 1/200th of the number of different things that you're supposed to be doing. So just keep in mind, there are now off-the-shelf platforms that do tick all the boxes for a secure system. The second observation that I would take from that survey are the characteristics that you're seeing on the left. I love these characteristics. These are, in fact, the list of characteristics that were provided almost exactly at that lunch survey moment 5 and change years ago. But what you'll also notice is these are the things that are marketed on every website page. This is not security. This is marketing-driven security that happens to overlap with some proper security terms. Real security, systematic security, is being able to show how you align with each one of these controls and having confidence either from your own team or, if needed, from a third-party auditor, that you do fully align with this. I keyed in some of these things so that you could see what the control families are, but you get the point. It's how well do I align with AC or AT or AU? And just having that on a page for yourself, that's what long-term alignment really looks like. So that brings you to, okay, how do I actually do this? And as a tool maker, we are certainly competing both on the marketing front, because that's, going backwards one, marketing-driven security from a tool maker's point of view is much, much cheaper because there are far fewer attributes you have to make sure are online for a particular sale. If people just care about these ones on the left, you can have a cheaper product. But from a security point of view, that's a really bad idea. What you want is the systematic security capability. So there you have to be investing in having true table-based alignment. So as a buyer, what do you need to look out for? If you're going to be buying an off-the-shelf solution, you and procurement both need to be fully aligned on the meaning of security and also the efficiency aspect. So testing and validation, either through pilots or through evidence that you're satisfied with in advance of that the connection experience is really usable and the administrative overhead is really light, is critical. The other thing is do a drill around deployment times. What we have found is a lot of solutions out there got good at getting a fast connection on a few attributes, but they really struggled when it came to deployment. But then the next piece is on cybersecurity attributes. Just ask for a table-based alignment. It's not that hard, but require it because a procurement officer can understand that. Okay, so conclusions, and then I've wrapped up my time. Don't forget the lunch survey. If they aren't willing to cut a check, it doesn't actually matter as a point of feedback. Firms have spent enough money to see the fires. Now they're going to start investing in putting them out. People are still building or buying point solutions. They don't have to. And off-the-shelf platforms are a viable answer, but it's incumbent on how the procurement is structured for that stuff to actually get pulled off. And in everything you do, remember, remote access is an efficiency tool, not a cybersecurity tool, and it has necessary cybersecurity attributes. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ian. And so I'll invite our other panelists back online, so Amir and James. And Ian, I'll just actually start with you since you were just up, and I think that you gave us a good point in terms of this segue that if folks in the audience were paying attention to, we've now sort of shifted gears where the first panel we talked a lot about detection, a lot about visibility. Here you're obviously hearing a lot more about protection. We're hearing a lot more obviously about remote access. So if somebody's reading the survey, they're going through the results, how are we breaking down those two? Like where do we actually balance between the idea of having detection and visibility, which is important, but also obviously the idea of having protection in place? Like what does that look like for you? And maybe just being able to draw those data points together.
So from an asset inventory point of view, it is not a comfortable feeling going in and enabling remote connectivity into a facility when you don't know what's inside of there. Because the other thing that you do not know yet is how many of those devices have legacy backhauls tied to them so that there's third-party access to a particular line. The main challenge is that larger firms will get gummed up on one of these two things, and they won't realize this unless they take a direction initially of I'm going to deploy asset visibility first, fine, and we will get to remote access enablement second, or we're going to ring fence the thing and then we'll do an asset inventory. You just end up wasting time having an argument. Both things are achievable in a single year, and it won't be perfect, but at least you'll be largely fielded in that year. So just start going one way or the other.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. And I want to pause and say I also really appreciate it for everybody's presentation. This is probably something that people don't realize in the audience, but the sponsors obviously get access to the survey results. So you saw like further interpretations of the survey, which is even as the author of the survey, I thought was really amazing to be able to see the different sort of commonalities and correlations that you all were able to bring to the table in those dialogues, which I would then pivot, Emir, to you, because I really like how you switched my metric of talking about detection and be like, well, 70%, we're not doing too great on these, especially when looking at like the breakout times and talking through attackers. And when we look through that and sort of pulling the thread from what Ian just said, specifically on remote access, and Ian, you did a great job being able to talk about the capabilities that we see in remote access. And when we talk about ICS OT, if we're not talking the current generation of stuff, we're talking about things that are likely 20 years old. What are those characteristics that we saw the breakdown for? Emir, in your mind, what are the most important remote access controls out of there? Like, what are the things that you're really driving for when you're saying, hey, if we're coming in and we're like ripping out the 20-year-old technology or putting something new and we're going to have this conversation, what are those capabilities look like for you? What are the most important ones?
Great question. So what we see is that you end up in places where there are OT systems that are running Windows 3.11 and the person who initially wrote it is dead. And like there's no more maintenance, right? And so like you end up in those scenarios where there simply is something that is an embarrassment and it's talked about in us, right? And so forth, but it is there, and it is something critical. It is something that's hard to replace, right? And we can try to quixotically take that on and try to like dispel it and create something new. But if we're being realistic, we have to work with what exists there. There are limited resources. There are things that need to stay up and so forth. What if we can shield it in some meaningful way? And let me have to understand what that means to be meaningful in that particular circumstance. And so the conversation usually pivots into like, what are we doing in terms of segmentation? What does that mean to your organization? How is that implemented? Which is really a precursor of making remote access have a meaningfully small blast radius to be effective, right? If you don't have segmentation, then what are we doing? I'm hearing saying audio is breaking up. Okay, is that all right? Sorry about that. Am I back or no? I'm trying audio. No. Okay.
Yeah, you are. Yeah, it seems like you're just like a little bubbly, like you're underwater.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll try to fix it, but yeah,
You seem fine now,
hold my
actually, for
time.
what it's worth.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so segmentation, and then so once you have segmentation, you have to then really define these apertures. And I think Ian, you're doing a great job explaining kind of what happens with all these extra kind of backhaul like legs where like, there's this thing that just has a 5G connection to, I don't know, somewhere in Asia, and they occasionally maintain it. Like those are things that we would like to chart and be able to, but like if it means that we're not securing RDP directly into like the, I don't know, water system because we are worried that there might be a 5G something, then our priorities are not correct. Like we need to stymie the flood of the easy attacks, because We have attackers that, like the Iranians, like if you look at the onslaught of attacks from Iran, these were not sophisticated. In fact, most nation state actors are not sophisticated. They're indistinguishable from script kiddies. Like, I'm not being facetious here. These aren't sophisticated attacks. It's just that we're so far behind when it comes to protection. And so we must be faster than the slowest zebra. We are, as an industry, the slowest zebra. That's why everybody's picking on us. Like, it pays money and it's easy, right? And we cannot be there for very long. So we must take advance. And so if we can seal off the highway of attacks, which is usually remote access into the main OT, if we can create jump boxes and secure the jump boxes in a meaningful way, you have done strides. And then we have this whole maturity curve, what you should do next and so forth. And we can go into those things, but if visibility, like knowing everything, that's the enemy of good. Perfect is enemy of good when it comes to these things. We must be pragmatic, right?
Perfection leads to nothing but ulcers, in my experience. Success is where we should be aiming for. I really like this sort of this commonality again, and this is what's great about having like really smart people on panels like this and being able to pull threads, being able to talk through the prioritization, right? And it seems to be a consistent theme that we're hearing, whether or not it's looking at visibility or it's looking at protection, but the prioritization of those aspects. And I choose to believe that hackers just look again for that path of least resistance. Not that they're like, fundamentally and unsophisticated. They're just like, oh, this is so easy. Like what's the Geico commercial? Like there you go. James, I'm going to pivot a little bit, and because you hit on what is actually one of my favorite statistics that was surprising to me a little bit in the survey. And it's not surprising when I say it out loud, but it's very surprising in terms of where has industry been driving us in terms of participation across the stack of leadership. And to see, like, after all this time talking about executives got to do more tabletops, executives got to be, they're the ones who've got the budget. And when we saw those organizations that were more prepared, they felt that they were fully prepared for future cyber threats. That was indistinguishable. Like the amount of executives who participated in the ones who felt that they were fully prepared to the ones who felt that they were no prepared, it was a standard distribution plot. Like they could not find anything that was really deterministic there. Managers, same thing. The only thing that stood out was, as you pointed out, the field techs. By having the field techs sort of involved in these exercises, we saw that preparedness piece. I think also, even when we talk about remote access, one of the reasons we need remote access is because of our field techs, right? Or lack thereof in some cases. So why do you think that is? Like having come from your background, why do you think that that's the sort of bellwether that it was to be able to say this could be a real big deal if we're not involved in this field techs?
It speaks to a culture thing, right? I mean, we believe working in the field and we're fighting the good fight, right? We're doing the right thing. We want to believe, and we're participating in maintaining safety. We're believing that we are maintaining the process. Those are the things that we are most focused on, right? But and OT people, I hate to say it this way, every hat, right? They wear hats on hats, right? As ridiculous as it is, they do. And they have to be a network engineer. They have to be an OT security guy. They've got to be a controls engineer. They know exactly what this process is and what's going to happen. If this particular tweak happens, it's going to blow up that tank, right? They have to know those things. So they have this vast knowledge of all of these things, which means that they are a resource, right? In the end, because they've worn so many hats, involving them in security means that they're going to bring another angle to it. They're going to bring the safety. They're going to bring the reliability or the resilience piece of it to the conversation. They're not just there with the well, send me out with the truck and I'll go fix it. I have my hard hat in my office. Like I'm always ready to fire jump or do what I have to do in order to help the situation. But back to that psychology piece, that psychology, getting the person to understand that they are a critical component of the whole security system, right? If I remove one component of a security system, it fundamentally changes the security system, right? We now no longer have detection here, or we no longer have visibility here, right? I remove my door, and now everybody just comes in and out as they please, right? I mean, I love the building a house and engineering a door with it. That to me was brilliant. not to go too much further, but I want to say one thing with regard to the remote access and visibility. If you were at DEF CON this year, the US Coast Guard did a presentation. They talked about Chinese manufactured cranes in the US and how they discovered a minimum of 2 modems attached to control systems, directly attached to control systems. Now, I have to assume those were for remote access and not any other purpose, and it was the vendor, bringing those things in. But visibility, right? I mean, it's not just about doing scans on networks and passively looking at things. It's also about walking the floor and looking for antennas.
And so that's an interesting, I'd say, segue, and this will be a question I want to ask all of you. And James, you'll be first up because you're the last to speak, and I'm just going to keep on going with that. So when I'm thinking about the thematic sort of discussions that you all hit at some point with this conversation on regulations and sort of that getting that base level and how threats are also counterbalancing that. And I know that was partly maybe just like, leading the horse to water with the way that we were identifying the trends from the survey, but really wanted to get everybody's sort of exploration on this, because I agree with the phrasing, like security does not equal compliance and compliance does not equal security. But what's the magic math that we could do when it's compliance plus security, right? We're investing in controls, but we now have evidence to say all the controls I'm telling you I did, I can do, and I can show you that I can do. What is the sort of the magic there? Like, what's the thing that you sort of took away looking at the statistics, looking at all the trends across the report from this tug and pull that's going back and forth there? So James, I'll start with you and then I'll move on.
Well, back to threat intelligence, right? Threat intelligence informs business decisions. I love that, right? We're focusing on what really matters. To me, that's we're not guessing. We're not trying to protect everything, because that's, it's not practical. It's impossible. It's not, it's not something that organizations have a financial appetite for, right? We want to focus on what matters. And so, starting with the regulation piece of things, I mean, to me, I do find it interesting and quite compelling. Some of the statistics that were around the regulation versus the unregulated, and how their response with incidents was different, right? As far as the effect on the organization. Does it mean that it is better? I don't know, right? I mean, what we could say statistically, there's data there to support that regulation actually helps. But or what I really appreciate are the organizations that are going above and beyond, right? Mm-hmm. Because they understand their role in society. Right. I deal a lot with, and maybe this is just my particular angle on things. I deal a lot with electric. I deal a lot with, oil and gas. And so with that, I mean, they understand that they're a critical part of this, and that compliance is a piece of it. But moreover, there is more discussion around, is this the right thing to do? And how is it helping to maintain business sustainability?
Right. And for sure, it sounds like, if regulation is right on the floor, then the threat intel, lets us know how tall the room is, because there's a lot more that may be happening on the depth side of that. Amir, you really called out the statistics there about, hey, if you are regulated, it looks like you've got like 50% less financial, less safety impacts. I think your quote there was something is going right. So expand on that a little bit more with this idea of the regulations and the threats, and what that means from either an impact perspective, or what is it maybe even just seeing from remote access and beyond.
Yeah, and I think maybe I called that out because it was so surprising to me that it was that there was something there, and that comes from just cynicism. And a cynic is a disappointed idealist. Like, I would love for compliance to just kind of tell you the things to do and to secure. And in many circumstances, in many fields in life, it can be. Like, I mean, house regulations, like, I mean, what you should do. This is all for good cause, and it's trying to reinforce something. But when you're doing compliance against a moving target, against an adaptive adversary that's incentivized to work around the things that you're coming up with, it doesn't work as well. And in particular, when things are accelerating like they are today, it's not working all that well. So I was actually surprised that it worked at all. And just to be fully cynical there, But I mean, it does speak to something that I think is interesting, which is to understand the latent impact of what's happened, right? We often we talk about cybersecurity controls, but there also are some understandings of things like the built-in engineering controls. For instance, like if I go ahead and I start to try to dump chlorine into a water treatment facility, I can't because the width of the pipe that dumps the chlorine in has been measured to be small enough that it's safe, right? There are like compensating controls that are even beyond our purview that exist and so forth. And if you have that context, sometimes you can prioritize more what it is that you really need to be doing. And so when compliance comes into the picture, you often end up with this kitchen sink of things that were really good ideas 15 years ago. And some are still good ideas, and some really are just a distraction. They're like checkboxing and so forth. And so what I think matters most is not to look at kind of what is being tried today. It's to look at successful attacks, which is why I agree with James about threat intelligence. Look at successful attacks and work backwards and see how would you survive those types of attacks? Would you have detected it? A lot of what we're talking about today is stuff that was detected, and a lot of attacks are not detected because they were successful, right? So we want to be able to have that picture, like almost like a Bayesian approach for the mathematicians, right? Of seeing what is it that really would have happened if something was different, and do I have the right things in place? That prioritizes those controls. There are good controls out there. We've talked about some of them, but some are far more important than others for your organization.
It's funny you talk about that. These are the detected events, right? And one of the things that I teach a lot when we talk about incident response in the electric sector and other sectors is that it's going to look and feel like a maintenance event, right? Like it's as much as I love the classic 1995 film, The Hackers, I have yet to see an attacker that has ever programmed a virus to sing row, row, row your boat while it's capsizing ships. It's going to be the RTU failed. And you're going to say, okay, the RTU failing, that's called Tuesday. It's a normal thing for me to deal with. I'll go into my maintenance thing, and it may not ever trigger to that conversation of like, is this an incident, right? And so I think if that's really relevant from the statistics perspective. Like even when we're pulling the statistics, which Ian, this then dovetails into your lunchline survey versus survey, right? Like I'm getting statistics from people who are saying, yes, I had an incident. It's an incident I know about. It's an incident that we're tracking. Here are the timelines I can give you for those things. If it's a maintenance event, was it an incident, and how would you know? And I think those are the interesting questions to pull from there. And I think if I now Ian asking the same question to be able to give you also the ability to weigh on the security and compliance discussion as well, really understanding from that perspective. I mean, remote access has obviously had some sort of tailwinds coming from compliance, right? Like for now, we can start seeing like insurance documentation coming into people being like, do you have multi-factor authentication?
Sure.
That was not the case 5 years ago, right? Like insurers didn't know what MFA was, let alone regulators, let alone seen in congressional testimony as we have in the past year. So where do you see that reside between, again, the floor of being what you can do on these controls like remote access versus the threat side? Like where does the security and the regulations line up for you?
So just speaking from a commercial perspective, I think that CMMC is having the most outsized effect right now because the reason why you're implementing these controls are not about defending the industrial systems from being ransomed as much as you're defending the systems from having a design pulled off the CNC machine as an exfiltration event, which is definitely, if done properly, going to seem like a maintenance event or a software patch event or some such thing. So for that stuff, compliance is necessary because everyone wants to make money in that business, and no one from federal was saying, well, we'll just subsidize the implementation of this stuff. So of course, what does everyone do? Some people take a gamble, and therefore they're able to bid lower versus others who are not willing to do that until they started to get rid of self-assessments on the higher level, and you had to have an audit coming in. And yes, the initial part of this is going to be extremely mechanistic because people haven't become well adjusted to seeing when a compensating control is in fact the best thing to put in place. So it's one of those segments where compliance is necessary because compliance assumes some third party is auditing what you're doing. And if you have some form of standard baseline there, you're going to have actual alignment. Most of the time, though, what you'll find is that if you aren't in a regulated setting, you're going to get people, it's a reflection of the leadership mindset of the firm and how well people are describing their particular risk sets and in a value that maps to the rest of the organization. And that's as much on us to teach everyone how to communicate as anything else.
That's because that goes back to actually again another common theme, this idea of culture, right? If it's a non-regulated, even when it is a regulated environment, there's probably a different culture, right? Because now I've got my internal audit team who's coming checking on my things, and I don't like them, they don't like me, and there's all this weirdness that may happen there. But culture, if there's no regulation, now has to come from somewhere, right? Is it coming from the top down? Is it coming from the field tech, right? To be able to highlight that statistic as well again. So I think that there's an interesting sort of discussion there to be able to play out. I think one last note that I wanted to get to before we ended, because I know that the three of you all got a lot of experience with remote access and perimeter detections and what this looks like from a protection perspective. And one of the statistics that was drawn out, I think, James, maybe you had it in your presentation, but don't worry, I'm not going to make you go first again. Was this conversation on the limitations of like what was the blocker that kept you from doing better remote access solutions. And the top one was limited resources, which again, we're going to hear that throughout on OT no matter what we do. But the second one, this is what I want to be able to get more opinions on, is this idea that remote access and legacy systems are just going to be incompatible. There's going to be limitations in those areas. Is that more of a construct of a mentality from 10, 20 years ago? Is that still real today as you're seeing it and you're deploying it in these systems where, we've got 30 connections from our different vendors and we're just going to maintain 30 connections, even though it's really painful compared to consolidation or using some of these next gen sort of capabilities that we highlighted before. So with that staging, Amir, I'll start with you. You were rapid fire on going off of mute, so you knew I was going for you. That's great.
No. Yeah, I can see your mouse moving. Now, there is this knee-jerk reaction we have as security practitioners, is that when something is uncomfortable or something is complex, we want to take it, we want to shove it into a box, we want to seal the box and just lock it away, right? And then we realize that it's not very useful in a box. And now we have to take the box, we have to drill a hole in it and all that stuff. This is a construct that we do over and over. Look at sandboxing. Look at all the different ways in which we construct cryptography. So, it's a theme throughout security. It's that we do this, and the same thing applies here, where we say there's this inconvenient OT system here. It's insecure. Shouldn't be online, and yet amazingly it is online. What do? Right? You want to shove it into a box, seal it off, do network segmentation, put it, and then you realize it's not very useful if you can't access it, right? So then you have to find that aperture, define some way of getting inside. That's where we end up with jump boxes and those types of approaches, right? And there's nothing inherently wrong with this, but it's easy. It's important to recognize that this is what is going on, right? Like you're creating a little Matryoshka doll of security, and you're hoping that some layer protects you from the rest, right? The best fight against complexity is simplicity, right? Try to simplify as much as you can, right? And I know this is a daring perspective in the day of AI, where we seem to want to make everything more complex by adding complexity to everything, but use simplicity. All the solutions that we all like to anything in life, they're all simple, aren't they?
Right.
Yep.
This
is how we get constructs where you can build something on top of, right? So if you can understand it, you can visualize it, you can see it. So if you have those constructs, you can build something that you can reason about, right? And I think that also applies to security solutions. If you're buying something that you truly don't understand because it's so large and complex, it's probably not doing what you need it to do, because you can't reason about it, right? So that's one argument I would say about when we think about these unfoldings. Right?
Yeah, so it is interesting because it almost comes into cultural change management. Again, I'm just going to use culture again as a sort of, but it's
Right.
simpler. It'll be easier to use. Field tech will likely be able to adopt it, and operator likely to be able to adopt it. Simultaneously, if it's simpler, then it's probably going to pass an audit as well, right? It's the compliance
100%.
risk is equal or almost proportional to complexity. So I think it's an interesting way to think through that. James or Ian, I'll open it up to either of you who wants to go off of mute first to be able to say this idea of legacy systems. Is that really the limitation that we're still seeing today when we talk about remote access, or is it something different?
The reason why that survey result was such a spike is because the There are three types of remote access solutions that are currently marketing themselves out there. One of them is the agentic push, which is contingent upon the systems being relatively modern that are out there. The second has a very low cost of goods, but there are several companies that are just parking a Guac server on-prem and then using that as your jump through, and then you can make all sorts of claims. But the problem is that there are very narrow compatibility options that you have through that. The third has a high cost of goods and is therefore not very palatable to third-party providers because, well, for obvious reasons, and that is you have to have a single tenanted virtual desktop that's running for each connection. So the heavy push over the last 2 years has been try and see if you can get sales on those first two. And because of that, you're going to see lots of people seeing lots of remote access tools, which are not very compatible with legacy systems. And there are only a handful of providers that are also offering the virtual desktop thing. So yeah, it's reasonable that the market is starting to develop this conception that I don't care what the remote access system is, it must not be compatible with my legacy tools.
So it's almost now it seems like it has to come back to me and on the SANS. We have to educate a little bit more on some of these next gen things, maybe a little bit. James, I'll leave it to you, and I'll give you the mic drop moment on this as well, because I need to be able to move us to our next panel. I know, no pressure, man. So legacy controls, and maybe it's more broad than remote access, but is this really a concern that we're still having, or have we been able to catch up? And I think it's also been another theme that we heard a lot of is we're playing catch up. I think Amira, Ian, I think you've all said that at some point during your presentations. So James, I'll leave it with you on sort of that closing note there.
Well, so I guess I think it's important to also differentiate what it needs remote access, right? Do we need remote access? We throw around remote access as though we need it all the time, right? Or that it is a requirement in order for us to even function or perform the responsibility, or for the machine to be able to perform its functions, right? I think you had an 83% that's throwing data for cloud telemetry.
Yeah,
right. I think that was an interesting statistic. But what is cloud telemetry? Is that remote access? No, that's data acquisition. We're sending data somewhere so it can be analyzed by cloud analytics. And so my thought is again back, and I think in my architecture I discussed remote access and being able to control that through appropriate architectures, right? Through something like a firewall where we need inbound access. But for the data acquisition piece, maybe we don't need that remote access, right? Do I need to have do the engineer connect to that system every time so I can start pulling data out of it? Or do I already have that data sent unidirectionally over a diode into the cloud, right? I think the diode offers, and as interesting this is, it offers the ability to Purdue level X to Y, right?
Right.
So, really it's going to be about, is remote access really needed all the time? Legacy systems, absolutely a challenge. I don't know that there's a good solution to that, but I'm glad that we're finally moving away from the whole VPN tunnel, like open VPN, as our methodology, right? That we're now putting more controls around user identity and what systems those users have access to from those jump hosts, right? So.
I've heard a pull thread that I heard a couple of times now then in this last part, and not just this for the controls, but it is that almost the cyber informed engineering piece, right? Like Amir even talked about like chlorine going through a tube. There are certain compensating controls that we have, not necessarily cybersecurity related, but just by the definition of what we operate, and that the operations are meant to be reliable and safe. And so we may be able to have these blended techniques where we're using cybersecurity and understanding where do we need these controls versus where are we already doing things in a different fashion. And so we do have some statistics on that. Also for folks who are opening and downloading the paper, I saw a couple of comments on that in the chat. We do have some conversations on cyber-informed engineering and some other topics similar. But first, I want to be able to thank our panelists and presenters, Emir, James, Ian. I really enjoyed having the conversation, but also your awesome slides and interpretation of our data, like giving you that data raw first, and then having you give me back things that I like. That was really great. I really did appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Did a great job. Thanks, Jason.
Appreciate it. Zero.
Awesome. Thank you. And with that, I will enter our next panel. I'd like to be able to invite both James and Dan to be able to bring yourself off of mute and to be able to see you on camera. So James is the Director of OT Solutions and Go-to-Market at Acronis. James is the Director of OT Solutions Go-to-Market at Acronis. Previously, you were involved in sorry, this is small font and also really hard for me to read right there.
I can tell the
Cybersecurity
story of my
cloud
life if
computing.
you want.
Yeah, no, this is good. I want to challenge myself a little bit. Cloud computing and networking at Forrester Researcher, HFS Research, Yankee Group, and the Info Pro. He has also held solutions, vertical product, and campaign marketing roles at tech security and networking vendors, including Sonos, Acme Packet, Bay Networks, and Motorola. Awesome. And on this closing panel, I'll also be having Dan Gunter. Dan is CEO and founder of Insane Cyber. He is the founder and CEO of Insane Cyber, a company specializing in forensic automation and threat hunting across industrial control and operational technology environments. Insane Cyber helps asset owners rapidly detect, investigate, and neutralize advanced threats, targeting critical infrastructure, bridging the gap between IT and OT cybersecurity. James and Dan, welcome to the closing panel. And we haven't had any large disagreements, so no pressure. But I may try to drive some debates, healthy debates, respectful debates, but debates nonetheless. Because folks haven't been able to hear a presentation from you, I would love to be able to get each of your perspectives on sort of what jumped out of you in the report this year. What were some of the key highlights for you that you then took away? And James, why don't I start with you and then move to Dan?
Sure. I'm going to have a hard time arguing with Dan unless he unmutes his mic. But I just want to say I'm an old cybersecurity guy. But since I came to Acronis, I've been focusing much more on the resilience piece. So I found a lot of fascinating data in the report, but I was wanting more about the recovery piece. I look at compliance regulations as they relate to OT and ICS, the cybersecurity standards bodies, you think of the NIST CSF and the CIS and so forth, or even what the insurance industry has been talking about. All their recent updates in the past couple of years have been partially about improving cybersecurity defenses and controls. They're name checking things like EDR these days that we never saw before, because the technology is relatively new. But there's a lot more emphasis that's brand new on backup and recovery, disaster recovery, and incident response that we haven't seen. So the nuggets that I could mine from the report on that stuff, on the resilience side, was the most interesting to me, and it kind of feels like there's still a fair amount of work to be done there.
Don't disagree. And equally, was the person who put together the questions and be able to do the survey and working with sponsors as to what we should look at more. I love the idea that we're able to do more on resilience and recovery.
I definitely gave that feedback.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I think it's definitely something that in previous years of surveys, and it's just because of the maturity of the industry, we're really focusing on controls and control management, but being able to say, okay, well, what happens? And maybe current threats like typhoon season are giving us more conversation points on what happens when the controls fail. And we have to recover, and we have to get into this idea of it's not just going to be an IT incident response. It's now a safety issue. It's now engineers and operators are going to help us bring the plant online. And what does that look like?
Yeah, I was afraid it was going to fall to me towards the end of the event to bring up Jaguar Land Rover. Fortunately, somebody else mentioned it. Because to me, that is just a massive case study in lack of resilience preparedness. Right.
Yeah.
To go offline and then to spend 2 months with all of your manufacturing facilities down, trying to rebuild, and at a cost of what I think it's going to be $2 billion in lost business and recovery costs by the time they're done with it.
Yeah, which is a striking and something we've always talked about in OT, is that the impact, it's high impact, low frequency, right? They may not always happen, but when they do, those impacts are so high compared to things that we may see on the IT side. Dan, how about you? What were the things that, as you're going through the report or even the conversations that were come place today, that really stood out at you?
I think certainly what James was just talking about with Land Rover, an interesting statistic people don't realize from Ponemon Institute, automotive actually has the largest hourly loss costs at 2.4 million an hour. Oil and gas is at about 1.6 million an hour when you look at operational outages, right? And what's interesting, right, to the point of like, why do security, why invest in it? That's just some of the outage. That's not the cost of responding, the cost of restoring, the cost of everything that goes in. And so I think it's also an interesting kind of case study, right? Because something we always work, and as you figure out how to talk to the board, something I've found as we've worked across folks, right, is certainly you tell that security story of like IR hours are expensive, but what's more expensive, right, is that industry average 2.4 million an hour that gets lost on automotive downtime, again by Ponemon Institute for folks who want to look that up, right? Coming into your paper, JD, I mean, how I always like this report, right? Because I feel like it gives a more like industry-wide view. Sometimes when we're down in the trees looking at every asset owner, you kind of learn like, okay, hey, I've never looked at my IR plan. Hey, I looked at it a few months ago. I looked at it 3 years ago. Seeing like kind of industry bought together metrics is huge. And some I'll pull out, 1 in 8 organizations, report full kill chain visibility. I think it was brought up there, right? Um, I'm curious of even if you push those ones in that one, like how many, if you started being like, okay, let's tabletop this, let's take this into GridX and actually do the tabletop part, and then actually go get the team during GridX to go out and try to pull data, see is it actually there? Are my backups actually going? Can I get to the data I need for my IR or other side on that, right? When was the last time that was actually confirmed? And do I even have it? Do I have enough network data? Do I have enough? I was with the Air Force CERT, and at the Air Force CERT, we would have alerts pop, and then we would have a certain amount of time because of the size of the Air Force network. We had to go pull data before, it was overwritten because of the operational size of the Air Force network. Things like that folks don't think of, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
it was interesting because I did want to get into some of those specifics. What I found out, just again wearing the data science hat, was once you get to a sample size with 14% of your population pool, and you start
Yeah.
drilling down to be like, do you do operational drills? Do you do simulations? Do you, like all of that was coming down to like an n is equal to 1.
Yeah.
And then for you to point people back to that figure 20 where we're showing the Purdue model capabilities as we go further down the stack. I'm
Mhm.
now dealing with like a very small sample size that it didn't seem right to be able to make a lot of those correlations. Hopefully, as that 14% widens over the future, we'll be able to do a lot more deep dive into some of those other characteristics. I think you're absolutely right. It's one thing to say I tabletop this and I will do a full bare metal restore. It'll take me 2 hours. Use my example before, but no, that's actually going to take me like 2 days. That's a huge disparity that will really change things out. Um, I want to follow up then on that concept. Plus, James, one of the things that you mentioned with this idea of resilience overall, right? This conversation point about we talked first about visibility. We talked then a bit about the protection side, and so I think that you pulling that thread there on that resilience. Walk me through like what does that OT resilience really look like? What does the good look like? If I were to say, is it just linking BCDR activities to what we're doing overall? Is it getting more executive management or the plant operators? Like, where does that resilience fit at the end of the day when we really want to talk about recovery?
Shall I start?
Yes, I'm directing that one straight at you.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. I didn't want to step on Dan's podium there. Um, yeah, I think about it purely at the operational level. It means having a golden image that you can restore to kind of a known goodness, right? It means being able to support those legacy systems. I thought some of the earlier panel discussion was really interesting, talking about Windows 3.1. I don't know many tools that reach that far back. Um, but for example, it really helps to be working with vendors who have lived in the OT environment for 20 years that can still help you with, I'm certain there's plenty of XP out there, and there's Linux 2.6 kind of systems out there that are still in operation. And the more of those that you can embrace in your tools and not have sort of edge cases that you have to manually administer, That simplifies things quite a bit and makes it easy for you to quantify your ability. We've got 90% of our systems covered to the point where we know if that there's an outage, whether that's a hardware failure or in the case of Jaguar Land Rover, a ransomware attack that spread from the IT side into the production environment, that you can restore. I think another issue, just from a purely operational standpoint here, is self-service recovery. We have a lot of customers who are out on oil rigs in the middle of the North Sea, or refineries in the middle of the Saudi desert, or power plants deep in the Amazon jungle, some of these big hydro plants. And they're not staffed with local IT because there's not enough IT on the floor to justify that headcount. Can you have the kind of recovery mechanism that an OT engineer or other plant engineer that has never sat at and doesn't ever want to sit at a backup console, the ability to kind of quickly restore that? I think if Jaguar had something like that, they could have gotten themselves back online in a matter of hours instead of 8 weeks of going from 1,000 cars and trucks being produced a day to 0 a day. So that kind of simple enough for local operators to initiate makes a huge difference, right? Dan pointed out about the auto is the kind of the extreme end of the example, but it's not hard to find the other end of the spectrum where it's costing you tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour. It doesn't all have to be 2.6 million an hour. Is scary, and frankly, those are realistic figures from our experience. You look at the outage that VW had during COVID, for instance, had similarly crazy $10 million a day kind of costs to it.
Yeah, and I think we'd all seen also similar. And sorry, just because we talked about
no, by all means,
real world events, right? And so like NotPetya gave us all a real good indicator. I mean, at a certain point, I felt like people are copying their homework because one organization said it took $300 million and the next one said, oh, that sounds about right too. And so like $300 million seemed to be the big impact. And that was like the biggest that we saw. But now we're talking about things in billions. And it really does shed light on this conversation of, okay, what would it have cost to have avoided that? And I guarantee you, it's not going to be hundreds of millions or billions of dollars when we look at that from a per site capability almost.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not hard to build the business case for kind of investing a little bit in better backup, shorter recovery times, and integrating all that into your incident response.
Yeah. So Dan, I want to pivot a little bit here because the resilience side, I think one of the things that I think we just touched on a little bit was like this idea of scenarios, right? And so the scenarios that matter most to you, being able to build resilience, backup recovery solutions similar to that. There's another area that you and I are very familiar with on building scenarios that we saw the data now for. I think I'm going to go with this. I think the first time until somebody tells me that this is not the first time that we've had this question, not just with SANS, but almost any survey that I've seen, where we've asked about like OT threat detection and what we can do from a hunting capability, right? And for those who aren't familiar with hunts, maybe Dan, I'd ask you to do a little bit about, the idea of creating a hypothesis and these scenarios, very similar to what James talked about for resilience. But the flip side of this is, how do you know an attacker is not there if you're not hunting? And can we do this in OT? And you and I come from a background where we know we can, but it doesn't look like many people are. And so maybe just walk me through that a little bit in terms of the obstacles, or maybe even how we can get better at something like taking the resilience conversation that James just had and making it actionable for security teams that want to do more hunts in the OT environment.
Yeah, absolutely. For one, it's funny, I just shared this paper and to talk up the SANS reading rooms and paper. I actually wrote 2 SANS papers, one on a threat hunt cycle a few years back, focused for OT, and then one how to tie threat intel to it. Funny enough, this week on timing an asset owner, we actually worked with an asset owner to walk through core parts of that. So there are some good SANS white papers. Look up SANS Dan Gunner threat hunting. There's one
the best one is SANS Dan Gunner. That's
there's one that'll pop up there, but on that, like threat hunting really is that side of like not just waiting, right? Going out, actually making sure, taking that threat intel you have, things like your threat intel feeds, not just the IOCs or that, but the techniques, right? Taking them into the field and saying like, okay, in this environment, one, would I see this? And two, do I see indicators of this in my environment? When you do that, the advantage is both it helps you identify blind spots and know gaps in the environment. We go into places where there's passive monitoring, and yes, that Boolean box is checked on we have passive monitoring, but we take the cord out of the back of that, plug it in, pull a PCAP, and we're like, this was installed 2 years ago and it's not actually looking at anything. And so it's good from the validating things like that. Or, the panel before was talking secure remote access, right? We still go into OT environments where the firewall is essentially a router because it has allow any rules, or the segmentation isn't actually lined up to where it should go. That matters a whole lot more, right? When you look at SMB-based malware, right? Look at the some of the big ransomware intrusions over the last few years that have used SMB and other protocols that, by the way, by control systems are required. Like you go into a Honeywell Experion, it requires SMB shares to be allowed in certain parts of the network, right? And so threat hunting is both a great way to apply that threat intelligence. It's a great way to go, kind of get pre-active. It's a great way to learn, kind of where you can either improve things or where, you need to push through. So as we go through, definitely starting with, that crawl stage of like getting proactive. Hey, what do I have? Panel earlier was also talking on asset ID, confirming like, right, is my asset ID actually does it line up enough? If I'm doing backups with Acronis or with other tools like that, do I actually have the right parts of this backed up? You can even go down to the engineering side, and if you're pulling ladder logic, do a coverage. Do I have ladder logic across my PLCs or other things? So if I do go into a situation where I need to rapidly rebuild and recertify and, not just recover, but fully restore operations, right? That you can do that. That's when you get into measurements that you can push up to a board that they care about, right? Because the threat hunting side is cool, but what matters for insurance and boardrooms more is that like what's mean time to recovery? That matters for some point, but what's mean time to restoration, right?
Right.
Because those two are very different metrics. And when you look at cyber insurance, when you look at other things like actually making sure you can operate in a reasonable pace at those speeds is super important. And I know I went all over a little bit there, but it starts with that threat hunting side that then actually does transition to like, oh, hey, we can actually improve like mean time to restoration or mean time to recovery if we do our homework and actually improve, right?
So you just touched on something that I think is really interesting, and I'll ask this question to both of you. James, I'll start with you. But when we look at this idea of response recovery, it often feels like it's a bit of an afterthought, right? Like this idea of integrating tools ahead of time, right? And I think we just hit on this a little bit, that it may not always happen. It may not. It's like the line to get from like point A to point B. If I were to just give a presentation on cybersecurity, it'd be like this. If I were to talk about like after an incident, it goes like over here and then it comes back over. Is there a sort of a logic behind that, or is there something we can do to change this sort of, I'm going to wait until the emergency happens to get ready for response and recovery activities earlier on? So James, maybe I'll start with you and then I'll pivot to Dan.
Sure. Well, first observing that I'm pretty sure at some point in my distant past, I also wrote a SANS paper. I can't remember if it was on GDPR compliance or if it was about session border controllers. Someone will have to look that up for me. Yeah, obviously in operational environments, we don't always have the luxury of scheduling downtime for testing. I've seen periods of like, well, we have half an hour on Christmas Eve if you want to test that restoral capability. And that's your window. So there is the concept of digital twins help here, right? Where you replicate your environment offline, and then you've got basically a playpen where you can test a bunch of scenarios without having any impact on the environment. And it also helps in general to have the ability to deploy things without requiring scheduled downtime, right? You want things that are fairly low impact there. But I don't see how you get around without replicating recovery environments that in many cases what you're going to run up against is the lack of availability for testing time, right?
Yep. That's, it's funny that you hit on digital twins, because I have another use case for digital twins that's constantly popping up in my own daytime job life, talking through like what technologies organizations are currently looking at. And obviously you can't like walk outside of getting hit in the face of something that's AI related. And unfortunately, going back to a lot of organizations in the ICS-OT space, no one's going to trust an AI to do anything in operations anytime soon, with the exception of, do I have a digital twin? Have been able to train a model on digital twins? And I think that there's probably like something to pull there of resilience from an operational perspective, and plus the cool, shiny, new, sexy thing that people want to do with AI, and like linking those two together in some capacity, because almost nobody wants to have the conversation of like the unsexy things to do, like data governance and digital twins, but they are very useful in some of the sort of operational constraints that we're currently talking through. Dan, how about you? What are the things, like when you look at this idea of we may be doing integration and tooling around resilience and recovery later in the game, people get religion after the incident. Is there a way to break this cycle, or what are your observations in there?
I think again, like a lot of self-awareness. So, right, having high IQ in your security program, but a lot of EQ too, understanding like, hey, these are where my we're smart, but we also understand like where our limitations are. I think that's one. Two, the compliance layer certainly plays in. We've worked with asset owners that have 6 different regulated environments at the same asset owners, all with their own tool sets and procedures and challenges on that. And then kind of what you were hitting to, right, is knowing like, okay, if something happens here, we'll do this, right? And that's where like, again, mentioned GridX earlier. I've played in GridX as a third-party vendor, as others have pulled in, and smarter asset owners are now starting to pull in and be like, hey, like a vendor could slow me down in this IR situation, and we don't want them to be surprised, and we don't want to be surprised with how this works or other things when it goes. And then final thing I'll say on that is just understanding your defensive TTPs. You bring up AI, a big challenge on AI is going to be like, okay, if it's on that digital twin, is that environment representative enough of your environment? The panel earlier, we're talking about the challenge of protocols. Does that AI understand these proprietary SDI protocol? Does it understand Emerson Innovation's suite of protocols like Yokogawa, the other very specific things, right? Yeah. Or is that AI just giving me generic, like what the next characters of things should be without actual, like it also has to be protocol aware to actually like coherently help to a level, right? So this isn't me saying that AI won't eventually be useful, but there is that side, especially in OT, to where like protocols matter for that monitoring protocols that do also matter as you train that AI, and a lot of intellectual property that some of the OEMs, quite honestly, would probably don't want trained in that right now.
I was going to say, as well as the conversation then goes back to maybe asking the OEM, how much documentation do you have for your own protocols?
Yeah.
And if the documentation coverage is not very high, the model's not going to be very good. So you're absolutely right on that. Keep an eye on time. I want to be able to give you each, I'm going to say, is make it 20 words or less. But I know we just wrapped on this survey, but already I am starting to think through what we're going to ask in 2026. And so for my final moments with you all, what would be the topic? What would be the question that, you just went through this survey? James, I'll start with you. Went through this survey. You've been able to read some of the results. Going into next year, what's the thing that you're like, I really want to drive into this topic, or this is the one question that I really want to ask folks going forward?
How quantifiable is are your recovery time objectives, and can you back that up with some kind of maybe offline or digital twin kind of testing data, or if you're lucky enough with scheduled downtime? because very often we find when push comes to shove that backups don't work because they haven't been tested, and that's a terrible time to realize
Find out.
you can't get a system online, particularly if you're in one of these industries where downtime costs you $500,000, $1 million, $2 million an hour.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Obviously we talked a lot about BCDR activities, but linking it back to RTO, RPOs specifically, and then you just find out if somebody even knows what those phrasings are, drill in a little bit further and see what they've done with that. I think that's great from an operational sort of simulation perspective. Dan, how about you? What would be the one question or topic that you'd want to be able to see in 2026?
I think it goes back to the survey, to the 1 in 8 on full ICS kill chain visibility.
Really drive down to them.
Are you still as confident in a year, and what's making you confident or not? And does that number go up, right?
I think I'll have to do a lot more tracking on putting in the survey, geopolitical sort of conflicts they're tracking, the different ransomware groups they're tracking, and then ask their confidence level. But I like that a lot. I do agree. If we can get a larger sample size than 14%, then we would have the capability to drill really deep into what it is that they're doing and finding those commonalities. Well, James, Dan, thank you so much for being my closing panel. Really enjoyed this conversation. I think it really helped tell the story between are we detecting to then are we protecting to now, okay, what do we do to recover and respond and get things going when a bad day actually happens? So thank you for being part of that storytelling. And thank you for being able to help us conclude out this discussion on the survey.
Thanks, Jason. Great to be here. Love the report. Looking forward to next year's.
Awesome.
Thanks,
thank you so much. And with that, closing remarks. So when looking at this, as I said before, I've been lucky enough to have been involved in SANS now for over 8 years, but even before I was an instructor, utilizing the SANS ICS Summit, which we had before we even had a curriculum. We were just getting together as the community to be able to say, this is the right thing for us to do and to have these conversations. To sort of quote Ian, there's a lot of conversations around the lunch line survey. That then turned into this formal survey that we've been able to do now for almost 10 years. And over that 10-year period, we've evolved the survey, right? This year, we did not ask about certifications or who owns the OT ICS cybersecurity program, because we now have 6-7 years of data that clearly define here's where certifications sit. We need to do a little bit better on getting people trained and up and aware. And also the CISO by far owns OT ICS security, and everything else besides that almost becomes noise. And so as we evolve into the different question sets, what we really want to make sure that we're doing different this year was addressing the elephant in the room with the different threats and the different activities that have currently taken place. I gave you some headlines sort of in the beginning to really then outline like what this was driving for us on. If we're talking more about the things like living off the land attacks, we're talking more through the cyber kill chain analysis and understand, do you have visibility on stage 1 and stage 2 of the kill chain? Being able to truly identify between the detection piece to the protection to now the response and recovery, having that story across the sort of the past, the present, and the future state that we may be able to lean into, we thought was really sort of an important shift for us to do this year. So again, you can download the report. Highly recommend being able to spend some time with it. There's a lot of data in there, a lot of figures and graphs. Really appreciated our sponsors being able to redefine some of the statistics even for them because they've got access to the data and they're able to talk through what was meaningful for them and be able to give us some different perspectives as well. So really wanted to highlight sort of the awesomeness that we have as a community here. And it's always been a community driven thing. The ICS OT security is a team sport. By our nature, we are not competing with one another in these spaces. We are working together. And you saw that with information sharing where everyone saw value in it. We saw that with people doing things with threat intelligence. And obviously we saw now the ramifications and the impacts, in some cases for the better because of the regulation pieces that are in place. So I want to be able to say, when we again talk about the urgent stories about where we got to in this survey, and the very first assessments that all of us would do if we were on the assessment side of the equation, we'd show up to a site and they'd say, well, how are we doing compared to our peers? And we would say, we don't know. We can't know. There's no data. There is now data. I really want to be able to encourage you to be able to use these as benchmarks. If you're finding yourself not having the capability, but 70% of your peers are, this may be a good argument for your management or your leadership to say, we should be looking at this thing. And so whatever that may be, if it's just a nugget in there that you can be able to leverage, highly recommend just being able to sit with the data yourself, understand what it means to you and your organization. And at the end of the day, take that deep breath that we heard previously from Rich, step back and say, defense is doable. you have a home field advantage by being able to use this data, be able to interpret it for your programs. I hope to be able to see you, whether it be at a SANS course. I, again, am teaching both ICS 456 later in December. I've already got a teaching schedule for the rest of the year, whether it be the next time we do the survey, which I'm slated to be able to author this time next year as well. Or if it's coming to SANS ICS events or any other SANS events that we have, this is a community sport. I'm really happy that you're all here and able to be with us during this time. I look forward to any responses or survey discussions that people want to have online, LinkedIn or otherwise. Just let me know. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason, and thank you to all of our speakers for your great presentations, and to Acronis, Clarity, Dispel, Dragos, Fortinet, Asane Cyber, Keystrike, and OpsWatt for sponsoring this webcast, which helps to bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.